In the last dark before the cold breaks, a cherry blossom branch carries its buds the way it always has. Not yet. Not yet. And then, in one morning, nobody predicted. Yes, there is a kind of ache that visits people in the quietest hours. Not grief. Exactly. Not fear. Something more like watching a train pull away from a platform and wondering if you were supposed to be on it. You look at other lives, or what you imagine other lives to be, and something tightens in the chest. They seem to know something you do not. They seem to be further along some road that you cannot find the beginning of. And you lie in the dark and turn a question over and over in your hands like a stone that will not warm. Why am I still here? And why are they already there? Tonight is for that question. Not to answer it, but to sit beside it until it changes shape. I have been collecting these stories for a long while now, and I want to say something honest before we begin. I don't always know what draws me toward a particular figure from a particular century. Tonight it was a line I came across in a translation of a Korean Seon text. A monk asking his teacher why his understanding felt so slow, and the teacher saying nothing, only pointing out the window at a plum tree still bare in mid-spring. I read it 3 times before I understood why I had been holding my breath. I grew up watching a mango tree in the yard take 2 full years longer than every other tree on the street to bear fruit. My grandmother said that tree is not slow. That tree is exact. I did not understand her then. I think I am beginning to now. Tonight we travel through 9 lives, from the mountains of Korea to the deserts of Central Asia, from the rainforests of Sri Lanka to the high plateau of Tibet, from a river valley in medieval Vietnam to a temple garden in Bhutan, where the winters are long and the plum trees do not apologize for their slowness. Each of these lives touched, in their own century and their own language, the same wound you may be carrying tonight. Each of them found something, not an answer, but a different way of holding the question. These stories are drawn from Seon Buddhism, Tibetan Nyingma teachings, Sri Lankan Theravada, Vietnamese Thien practice, the Drukpa Kagyu lineage of Bhutan, and several lesser-known currents that rarely appear in Western tellings. We will go slowly. There is nowhere to arrive by morning. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. If you would like to leave one word in the comments, just one word for what you are carrying tonight, I would be glad to find it there in the morning. If you are lying down, let your body feel the surface beneath it. If you are sitting, let your back find whatever holds it. The breath does not need to be changed or deepened or controlled. It is already moving. It has been moving all day without you having to ask it to. Let it continue. You only need to listen. And if tonight's stories take you to sleep before they are finished, that is not falling behind. That is exactly right. The branch does not rush. It has never rushed. Somewhere in the cold, before the cold breaks, it is already becoming exactly what it is going to be. The bell that called the monks to morning practice carried differently at different altitudes, and at Anguksa, high in the hills above Haeju, it arrived in the courtyard, already softened by distance and cold air, the way a sound sounds when it has traveled a long way to reach you. The courtyard tiles were the color of old rain, the particular gray that stone becomes when it has held winter for many months. The air smelled of pine resin and of something else, the specific cold that lives only inside a room that has been prayed in without interruption for a very long time. A cold that is not emptiness but its opposite. It was the 14th winter since Baekun Gyeonghan had returned from Yuan, China, and the monastery he guided was full, as it always was in those years, with young men who had come from the provinces carrying questions they could not name. The monks' hall held 20 bodies on thin mats, and in the coldest part of winter, you could see the breath of the sleepers rising in the dark like 20 small offerings. The kitchen fire was started before the first bell, and by the time the monks filed into the courtyard for morning practice, the smell of barley porridge had already worked its way through the uninsulated walls, a thin, clean smell that was also the smell of every morning here, inseparable from the sound of the bell, from the cold tiles under sandaled feet, from the particular quality of pre-dawn silence that a mountain creates when it is holding snow and releasing it very slowly into the air around it. This was the nature of that time. The Goryeo dynasty was aging at its edges. The Confucian scholars at court had begun to say, openly, that Buddhism had run its course, and so the young men who still came to the monastery gates came with a particular kind of urgency. The urgency of people who are not entirely sure the door will still be open next year. Zhang had come from Gobu, the same province where Beigun himself had been born, though Zhang did not yet know this. He was 22 years old, the third son of a grain merchant, and he had arrived at the monastery gates in the early autumn of his second year of seeking, thinner than he had been when he left home, carrying a cloth bag with almost nothing in it. He had a habit of pressing his lips together when he was thinking, and another habit of arriving early to every sitting, not out of piety, but out of a private fear that something important might begin before he was in position to receive it. These habits had come with him from home, and he had not yet examined them closely enough to understand what they meant about him. He had come because of a dream, not a dramatic dream, not one with light or voices, only a dream of sitting very still in a room he had never seen, and waking from it feeling, for the first time in years, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The abbot had looked at him for a long time before speaking. Then he said, "You can stay." That was the beginning. The question, the one that would grow in Zhang over the months that followed, quietly and then less quietly, was this: why did Beigun never say anything about his practice? The other young monks received responses, brief ones, sometimes only a gesture, but responses. Brother Wool was told that his sitting was becoming quieter. Brother Songam was corrected on the position of his hands. Even Brother Daesuk, who had arrived 2 weeks after Zhang and seemed to understand almost nothing, received a nod from the abbot one morning that made the whole room feel it. But Zhang sat and sat and sat, and the abbot passed him in silence, and then passed him in silence again. And after 6 months of this, Zhang had begun to understand the silence as an answer of its own. The answer was not yet, or perhaps not enough, or perhaps, and this was the one that visited him at night, the one he tried not to follow to its end, perhaps not you. He had spent 2 years watching the other monks bloom, and had begun, without meaning to mistake their season for the only season. He kept his doubt inside his practice, which is to say, he kept it very close to him and tried to hold it still. He did not speak of it to the other monks. He watched Wool and Songam in the meditation hall and noticed, against his will, the particular quality of stillness that seemed to come to them with less effort than it came to him. And he tried to remember that effort was not the point. And then he tried to understand what the point was. And then the bell rang, and the sitting was over, and he was no closer. In the spring of his second year, Beigun gave a talk in the main hall on the subject of no mind. Not the concept. The abbot never lectured on concepts the way the scholars did, but the practice of it. The texture of what it was like to move through a day without the self constantly narrating itself. He said, most of you are practicing in the wrong direction. You are trying to empty the mind. The mind does not empty like a bucket. It stills like water. You cannot force water still. You can only stop disturbing it. Jung heard this and felt something shift, and then felt it close again before he could see what it was. Afterward, in the courtyard, he watched Wool speak to the abbot with the ease of someone who had always known how to speak to teachers, and he noticed how Bagun listened and nodded and said something that made Wool's face change in a way that Jong could not decipher. He stood by the well and looked at his own hands and thought, I have been here 2 years. I do not know if I have moved at all. That night he could not sleep. He lay on his mat in the monk's hall, listening to the breathing around him, some steady, some just slightly irregular. The breathing of people who were also not sleeping but were being quiet about it. And he turned his question over in the dark. What is wrong with me that I cannot feel what they can feel? It was nearly the end of the 4th watch when he made the decision to ask. He went to Bagan the following morning, after the first sitting, when the abbot was walking in the small garden on the east side of the temple. The garden held 3 plum trees and a stone basin and almost nothing else. Bagun walked the same path each morning, the path between the trees and the basin, and he walked it slowly, which is to say he walked it at the speed of someone who was not going anywhere. Jong stood at the edge of the garden and waited. The abbot turned at the end of the path, saw him, and walked toward him without changing his pace. Jong bowed. Then he said, I would like to ask you something. The abbot stopped. He looked at Jong with the particular attention he gave to things he was not yet finished examining. Jong said the others seemed to be advancing. Brother Wool, Brother Sungam, even Brother Daesuk. I have watched them, and I see something happening in them that I do not feel happening in me. And I want to know. He paused, and made himself say the rest of it. I want to know if there is something I am doing wrong, or something I am missing, or something about me that makes this harder. The abbot was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Come back here after the evening sitting. Jung bowed and withdrew, and spent the entire day in a state he could not name. Not hope exactly, not dread exactly, but the particular feeling of a person who has asked a question they cannot take back and must now wait to hear the answer. He sat through the morning practice and the afternoon reading with the sensation that the waiting itself was a kind of examination. He noticed himself watching the other monks again and forced himself to stop. He swept the walkway between the kitchen and the hall, which was his task for that week, and found that his arms moved through the motion without his usual restlessness, as though the question he had finally spoken aloud had taken some pressure out of the day. He had carried it for so long without naming it that the naming had changed its weight, not lifted it, only redistributed it, the way a bag feels different when you shift it from one shoulder to the other. He ate the evening meal in the proper silence. He sat the evening practice without looking at anyone, and then he went to the garden. After the evening sitting, when the hall had emptied and the lamps had been brought in, Jung returned to the garden. It was nearly dark. The plum trees were shapes against a sky that had gone the deep blue that happens just before it becomes black. Bagun was standing beside the stone basin. He pointed, without speaking, at the middle plum tree. Jung looked at it. In the dimness, he could see the branches, but not much else. The abbot said, "What do you see?" Jung said, "A plum tree." The abbot said, "Look again." Jung looked. He saw the tree, the same tree that had been in this garden for years, the one he had walked past 100 times without stopping. He noticed, for the first time, that it was bare. The 2 trees on either side of it had already begun to show the first suggestion of bud, the barely there swelling that meant the cold was starting to release its hold. This tree had nothing. He said it has not budded yet. Bagan said it blooms last. Every year, this tree blooms last, long after the other 2 are in flower, long after the early bees have found them. This tree is still holding its buds inside the cold. And then, when it finally opens, he paused. Have you ever seen it? Jong had not. He realized, with a small shock, that he had never been in the garden at that particular moment. The abbot said it blooms in a single night. You go to sleep with bare branches and wake to this tree entirely open. And what it gives is different from what the other 2 give. The other 2 give flowers you have seen before. This one gives something you cannot look at directly for very long. Jong looked at the bare branches in the dimming light. He did not speak. The abbot said, you have been watching the other monks the way you watch these trees, measuring their flowering against some calendar inside you that has decided when flowering should happen. This calendar is not the garden's calendar. It is yours. Jung said, but how do I know if I am progressing at all? And Bagon said, in the tone he used when he was not trying to make a point but simply describing what he saw, the plum tree does not know it is late. It only knows the cold, and then the warmth, and then, without apology, itself. Jung stood in the garden for a long time after the abbot had gone in. The sky had completed its darkening. The 3 trees were now simply silhouettes, indistinguishable from one another. In the dark, you could not tell which was bare and which had begun to bud. They were all just trees in a garden, in the cold, in the dark, doing exactly what trees do when no one is measuring them. He went to sleep that night and did not wake until the bell. He sat the next morning with something slightly different in the quality of his sitting. Not better, not more advanced, only quieter at the place where the comparison usually lived. He did not know if this would last. He suspected it might not, that the comparison would return, that he would again find himself watching wool or songum and feeling the old tightening. But for now, this morning, there was a space where the tightening usually was. And in that space, something that was very close to stillness. 3 springs later, he was in the garden when the middle plum tree bloomed. He had nearly forgotten the conversation. Or not forgotten, but let it settle so deep that he did not think of it daily anymore. He woke in the night to use the latrine and passed the garden on his way back and stopped. The tree was entirely open. In the moonlight, the flowers were not white, but silver, and there were more of them than he had expected, dense, improbably. Too many for the branches to hold easily, so that the whole tree seemed to be barely containing something that wanted to be larger than the tree was. He stood there in the cold until his feet went numb. He could not have said what he was feeling. It was not triumph. It was something quieter than triumph, something that did not need a name, that simply required him to be present for it. He did not wake anyone. The tree was not a teaching meant for him. It was only a tree, in a garden, in the silver cold of a night that would have happened with or without him. He went back to sleep. In the morning he sat with the others, and the sitting was, as most sittings were, ordinary. The bell rang. The day began. Let that settle for a moment. There is a thought that visits almost everyone at some point in the quiet. You look at another life, or what you believe you can see of it from the outside, and something in you begins to calculate. They are there. You are here. The distance between those 2 points feels, at 2 in the morning, like a judgment. But you have never seen the inside of another person's cold season. You have only seen what they have brought to the surface, the flowers, already open. You have not seen the years of bare branches. You have not seen what it cost them to wait inside a winter that felt, from where they stood, exactly as long as yours feels to you now. The comparison feels like information. It is not information. It is only the mind doing what the mind does when it is tired and has not been given something better to hold. Let the shoulders have this for a moment. Nothing is required of them right now. The plum tree did not watch the other trees. It could not. It only received what the season gave, and gave back what it had. And what it gave, when it finally gave it, was unmistakable, not earlier, not later, but exactly on time, according to a calendar that was entirely its own. You have been doing this too, even in the seasons that felt like nothing was happening. Especially then, the cold does not mean nothing is occurring. It means what is occurring inside, where you cannot see it, where no one can see it, where the only measure of it is the tree itself and the particular morning it chooses to open. You do not have to have figured out something by tonight. You do not have to be further along. Not tonight. Not in this moment. In this dark, with the breath moving exactly the way it is moving right now, without your instruction, without your effort, in exactly the rhythm that has always belonged to you and no one else. If you can feel the weight of the blanket or the surface beneath you, let yourself feel it now, not as something to adjust, only as something that is already there, already holding. The monk Zhong sat in that garden for 3 more years after the night of the flowering. He became, in time, one of Bagan's most trusted students, not because his progress had been faster than anyone else's, but because he had learned to stop measuring progress against a calendar that was not his own. What he passed on to his own students, years later, was not a doctrine. It was a kind of permission. The permission to be exactly where you are, in exactly the season that is yours, trusting that the cold knows what it is doing, even when you do not. The breath knows this already. It has always known. In and out, in exactly the rhythm that belongs to you alone. Let it carry you, somewhere further east, in a different kind of cold. The dry cold of high country, where the wind comes off stone and not off water. A woman had been keeping a question inside her for longer than she wanted to admit, and the question was beginning to find its shape. The river that ran past Kofap village made a sound in early spring that it did not make at any other time of year. A lower note than summer, fuller than the thin trickle of dry season, as though the river itself was clearing its throat after a long silence. From the window of the small temple at the edge of the village, you could hear it before you could see it, and the monks who lived there had learned to use that sound the way other people use a clock, to know where in the night they were, how much dark remained, how close the morning bell. The courtyard of Lukta temple held one flame tree and a stone well and a row of clay tiles along the eastern wall that trapped heat until mid-afternoon and then released it slowly. The way a body releases the warmth of a fire it has been sitting beside. The smell in the courtyard was of river mud and incense, and the particular green smell of things growing faster than the eye can follow. the smell of a place where the distance between seed and leaf is very short. Van Han had lived in this temple since before some of the youngest monks had been born. He was in his 61st year when the story that matters most began, and by that point the villagers had long since stopped thinking of him as a newcomer. He was part of the landscape the way the flame tree was part of the landscape, so present that you could not imagine the courtyard without him, and so quiet that you sometimes forgot he was there. He had a way of moving through the temple that left no noise behind. His sandals on the stone made less sound than bare feet would have. He had the habit, when listening to someone, of becoming very still, not the stillness of someone holding themselves back, but the stillness of something that has simply stopped being in a hurry. The younger monks sometimes found this quality more disquieting than a reprimand. A reprimand you could argue with, or resolve to correct. That stillness asked you nothing, and so you had to ask yourself. The young woman who arrived at the temple gate on a morning in the second month of the year did not come seeking Van Han, which was, in a certain sense, why she found him. Her name was Lan, and she was the second daughter of a fabric merchant from the neighboring district, and she had walked 4 hours to reach the temple with a question she could not put fully into words, only into a feeling that she had spent the last 3 years doing everything correctly and had arrived at 30 years of age with the distinct and unbearable sense that she had somehow fallen behind the life she was supposed to be living. She had 2 older brothers who had established themselves in trade, one in river transport, one in the silk markets further north, both married, both with households that ran with the ordered confidence of things that have found their proper shape. She had a younger sister who had married at 22, who had children already, who spoke in sentences and ran across the courtyard with the particular recklessness of children who have never doubted that the ground will hold them. She herself had learned her father's craft so thoroughly that she could look at a bolt of silk and name the province where the worms had been raised, the season of the harvest, the method of the spinning. She had a small loom of her own now, set up in the room at the back of her father's house, and she had begun to develop a pattern that was different from anything her father made, more intricate, slower, requiring a particular attention to the tension of each thread that could not be rushed without losing the quality that made it what it was. She was skilled. She knew she was skilled, but skilled was not the same as arrived, and arrived was what she wanted, and what arrived meant she could not have said exactly, except that she would know it when she felt it, and she had not yet felt it. And most mornings, now she woke before the household and lay in the grey light and felt the familiar tightening in the chest that she had started to understand as the particular weight of a life that is somewhere behind where it is supposed to be. She did not know if this was a spiritual question. She had not come to the temple for spiritual reasons. Particularly, she had come because a woman in her district had told her that Van Han sometimes spoke in ways that rearranged things, and she had nothing left to lose by hearing words that rearranged things. She did not know if this was a spiritual question. She had not come to the temple for spiritual reasons. Particularly, she had come because a woman in her district had told her that Van Han sometimes spoke in ways that rearranged things, and she had nothing left to lose by hearing words that rearranged things. The monk who answered the gate was young and earnest and offered her tea in a small room near the kitchen. She sat for a long time. The temple was quiet in the way that temples are quiet, not empty, but organized around something that does not make noise. When Van Han appeared in the doorway, she almost did not recognize him as the person she had come to see. He was shorter than she had expected. He sat across from her without ceremony and waited, and the quality of his waiting was such that she found herself speaking before she had decided what she wanted to say. She told him about her brothers. She told him about her sister's children. She told him about the feeling, the specific texture of it, that had been living in her chest for 3 years now, the sense of being on the wrong side of a door through which everyone else had already passed. She said, "I have done everything I was supposed to do, and I feel nothing like what I thought I would feel by now. And I do not know if this means I have done the wrong things, or if I am a person for whom the feelings never arrive, or if there is something about me that is simply—" She stopped. Van Han said simply what? She said slower than it should be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does your loom make that no other loom in your district makes?" She looked at him. The question seemed unrelated to everything she had just said. She said, "I work with a particular pattern, a river pattern. My mother taught me, but I changed it. The spacing is different. Most weavers use 3 threads for the waterline. I use 5, and I pull the last 2 at a different tension. It takes longer. The cloth takes almost twice as long to produce as a similar piece from another weaver, but the drape is different. You can feel it when you hold it. Most people cannot say exactly what is different about it. They only know that they do not want to put it down." Van Han said nothing. She said, "I don't see what this has to do with." He said, "You changed the pattern because 3 threads were not enough. Not because the other weavers were wrong. Because something in your hands knew more was needed." She was quiet. He said, "You are comparing your cloth to cloth made on a different loom, for a different purpose, in half the time. And you are calling yours late." The word landed with a weight she had not prepared for. She said, "But the feeling—" He said, "The feeling is real." "I am not saying the feeling is not real. I am saying the feeling is comparing. And what it is comparing is not comparable." She sat with this. Outside, the river went on making its particular sound, which was the sound of water that has traveled a long way and is not yet where it is going. She said, "How do I stop comparing?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in the same tone he would use to name the weather, "You are asking the wrong question. You do not stop the comparing by fighting the comparing. You return to the loom. You feel the tension of the 5th thread under your fingers. When you are in that tension, there is no room for what the other weavers are doing. There is only the cloth that only you can make, becoming itself." She held this in her hands the way she held fabric, testing the weight of it, feeling where it gave and where it held. She wanted to argue. She could feel the shape of the argument, that it was easy to say the comparison was wrong. But the comparison did not ask permission, and she had tried many times to set it down, and it had simply returned, picking itself up from wherever she had left it, and walking back through the door as though it lived there. She said, "I have tried to stop comparing. I know it is not useful. I know the feeling is not giving me correct information. But knowing that has not made it stop." Van Han looked at her with the quality of attention she had noticed from the beginning. The attention of someone who is not preparing a response, but simply receiving what is being said, fully, the way a wide river receives rain. He said, "You are trying to argue with the rain." She was quiet. He said, "The comparing comes because you are a person who measures precisely. This is the same quality that makes you pull the 5th thread at a different tension. You feel when something is not right. The comparing is that quality turned in the wrong direction, aimed at the distance between you and someone else, instead of at the cloth under your hands. You cannot destroy that quality. You can only redirect it." She said, "How?" He said, "Return to what only you can feel. The thing your fingers know that no one else's do. When you are there, the comparison has nothing to hold on to. It requires distance. It requires that you be looking outward. Give it nothing to see." She sat with this for a long time. The monk who had brought her tea appeared in the doorway and then withdrew, reading something in the quality of the silence that told him this was not yet finished. Outside, a child ran across the courtyard and stopped at the well and looked down into it the way children look down into wells. Not for water, but for the particular fascination of depth. The sound of her feet on the stone courtyard tiles came through the window clearly, then receded. She held this in her hands, the way she held fabric, testing the weight of it, feeling where it gave and where it held. She walked back to her village in the afternoon. The 4 hours felt shorter in this direction, which she had not expected. Not because anything had been resolved. The comparison would return. She knew it always returned, but because something had been set down for now. The weight of it was still in her hands, still in her chest, but it had shifted slightly. It was the same stone she had carried for 3 years, but she was holding it differently. And holding something differently is not the same as putting it down, but it is not nothing either. The river ran alongside the road for the first hour. She could hear it before she could see it, then see it, then lose sight of it as the path curved away toward higher ground. The first new green was showing on the hillsides, not the full green of late spring, only the suggestion of it. The green that appears when the cold begins to lift and the plants remember what they were doing before winter interrupted them. It was the green of things that have been waiting without urgency. She stopped once, where the path crossed a small stone bridge, and looked down at the water moving beneath her. The water did not look like it was in a hurry. It did not look like it was behind. She arrived home before dark and went directly to the room where her loom stood. She did not sit down at it. She only rested her hand for a moment on the wood of the frame, the particular warmth that wood holds from a day in a room where someone has been working. And then she went to help with the evening meal. The cloth she made that year became the piece her district was known for. Eventually, she did not know that yet. She only knew the loom, and the tension of the 5th thread, and the slow patience of making something that takes longer because it is trying to become exactly what it is. There is something in you tonight that has been comparing. Not cruelly. The comparing is not cruel. It is only a mind doing what minds do when they have been given too much quiet and not enough direction. It scans. It measures. It finds a point elsewhere and draws a line from there to here, and calls the length of that line a distance you have fallen behind. But you have never seen the full cloth. You have only seen what others have brought to the surface, the piece already finished, already folded, already displayed. You have not seen the loom. You have not seen the extra threads, the longer hours, the particular tension that makes their cloth what it is. And you have not seen, could not see, how different your loom is from theirs. How what you are making could not be made on any other loom. How the slowness you have been calling failure is the slowness of the 5th thread, the thread that changes everything. You have thought of yourself as someone waiting to arrive, but you have been weaving the whole time. Think of a moment when you were so absorbed in something that you forgot to check how you were doing. A task, or a conversation, or something moving so close that the only possible response was to be there with it entirely. You were not comparing in that moment. The comparing requires a kind of distance. It requires you to step back from your own life and look at it from outside. When you are fully in your hands, There is no outside. Let the jaw soften now. There is nothing to hold there. The river does not compare itself to the river in the next valley. It only moves through the landscape it has. It finds its way around each stone not because it is patient. It does not know patience, but because it has no map. And the only direction it knows is the direction the ground allows. That is not failure. That is the river being exactly what a river is. You are already moving. Even tonight, even in the stillness of this moment, something in you is continuing, moving in the direction that is yours, at the pace that is yours, with the particular quality that only you can bring. The loom is yours. The cloth is yours. The tension of the fifth thread, the thread that takes longer, the thread that makes the drape different, is yours alone, and no one else can feel it. You do not have to have arrived. Not tonight. Not in this room, in this body, in this breath that is moving now without your instruction, steadily, without hurry, in the rhythm that has always belonged to you and to no one else. The weaver went back to her loom. The river went on. The temple in Kofap village stood in the same courtyard where it had always stood, and the flame tree in the corner was already preparing, though no one could see it yet, to bloom. Rest here now. Feel the weight of whatever is holding you, the surface beneath the body, the air against the skin. There is no next thing that needs to happen. Let the spine settle into whatever holds it. You have been carrying this long enough for one night. The loom will still be there in the morning, and somewhere to the north and west, across mountains that hold their snow until late spring, even as the valleys below have long since warmed. A man had been carrying a single question for so many years that he had forgotten it was a question. He had started to believe it was simply the shape of who he was. The wind that came down from the higher passes in late autumn did not arrive in gusts. It arrived as a condition, a change in the air that you felt on the back of your neck before you heard anything, the way certain arrivals announce themselves before they appear. From far below, where the valley floor met the first rock shelves of the mountain, the sound of the river carried upward in the cold, thin and distant at this height. More suggestion than sound. The way a memory sounds when it has traveled a long way to reach you. The cave entrance showed a rectangle of sky that was the particular deep blue of altitude, a blue with no white in it anywhere, clear as something that has been made rather than occurred. And the stone of the cave wall, where Rachungpa's shoulder rested each morning during practice, had taken on the temperature of the body. Not warm exactly, only no longer cold, the stone and the man having reached, over years of daily contact, some agreement about heat. The cave at Rechung Phug sat above the valley, at an altitude where the sky seemed closer than it had any right to be, and the rocks around the entrance had been smoothed by the hands of practitioners over decades. The stone worn to a particular softness that is only produced by long devotion and cold. Inside, the smell was of juniper smoke and old wool and the thin, clear cold that exists above a certain height, a cold that does not carry dampness, that enters through the nostrils like something almost medicinal. The light, in the hours around midday, came through the cave entrance at an angle that fell directly onto the flat stone where a meditator would sit, and then shifted away as the afternoon moved. And by the time the light was gone, the practitioner would have been sitting long enough that the loss of it barely registered. Rechungpa had lived in this cave and in others like it for long enough that he could no longer remember clearly what a house felt like. He was 31 years old, which was not old and was not young, and he had been the disciple of Milarepa, the great yogi of southern Tibet, the cotton-clad hermit whose songs were already being passed between villages like something precious and perishable for nearly half his life. At the age of 12, Rinpoche had been herding cattle on a hillside when he heard singing from somewhere above the path. He had followed the sound, partly out of curiosity, partly out of something he could not name then and could not fully name now, and found the old man sitting in a shallow cave, wrapped in a single cotton cloth despite the cold, eyes half open, voice producing something that did not belong to ordinary singing. The sight had produced in Rinpoche a state he would spend years trying to describe, a wordless recognition, as though he had been looking for this specific face for longer than he had been alive. He had abandoned the cattle and gone home to his mother and told her he was leaving, and she had said nothing useful, and he had gone back to the cave the following morning and sat down, and Milarepa had looked at him for a very long time and then said, "You can stay." That had been almost 20 years ago. In the interval, Rinpoche had memorized teachings in languages he was still learning, had climbed passes that cost him the feeling in two of his left-hand fingers for several winters, had traveled to India and negotiated with masters who initially refused to receive him until they heard the name of his teacher, at which point their manner changed in the specific way that the mention of a formidable name changes a room. He was a compact man, quick-moving, even at altitude, with hands that had grown calloused from the climbing and rope work that high country practice required. He had a memory that had always been extraordinary. He could hear a teaching once and recall it in sequence years later, word for word. And this gift had made him, in his early years with Milarepa, an efficient and confident student. He had arrived at his practice the way a skilled craftsman arrives at a new tool, with the assurance of someone who expected to be good at this, who had been good at most things he had tried. This confidence was not arrogance. Exactly. It was more like a very old habit of competence that had calcified over the years into something he could no longer examine from the outside. He knew he was good. He had carried water and gathered firewood and memorized teachings for which there were no texts. He had made the difficult journey to India and back not once but twice already, bringing transmissions his teacher wanted, and that existed nowhere in Tibet. He had done everything a disciple could be expected to do, and had done it with a genuine love that was also, this was the part he could not fully admit, a genuine need to be recognized as someone who had done it. And there, precisely, was the problem. His teacher had two principal disciples. The other was Gampopa, a monk, precise and scholarly and methodical, a man who built monasteries and trained hundreds of students through the formal structures of institutional teaching. Where Rinpoche wandered, Gampopa organized. Where Rinpoche brought back tantric transmissions from India in fragments and oral threads, Gampopa wove doctrine into systems that could be taught, reproduced, transmitted across generations. Rinpoche had sat in his cave many nights and told himself, honestly, that Gampopa's way was not his way, and that his way was not better or worse, only different. He had told himself this many times. The telling of it, with such frequency, was itself a kind of answer. The comparison had a specific texture. It arrived most often in the hour after the midday meal, when he sat at the cave entrance, looking out at the valley, and the light was too direct for comfortable meditation and too quiet for sleep. He would think of something Gampopa had built, a new hall for the winter teachings, word of which had traveled through the mountain routes, Or he would recall a conversation in which someone had mentioned Gampopa's name with the particular reverence that the name of a builder earns, the reverence given to things that can be walked into and touched. And then, in the same motion, he would take account of his own work, the teachings he had brought from Tifupa, the Dakini transmissions that existed nowhere else in Tibet, the oral threads that lived inside him and would only emerge when he chose to give them, the work of a channel, the work of a carrier, the work of someone who moves through the world without leaving a structure behind. He was proud of what he had done. He needed to be seen being proud of it. That was the thing he could not find a clean way to admit. The question that had been growing in him, which he had been naming wrongly for several years, calling it doubt about practice, calling it restlessness, calling it the ordinary difficulty of solitary retreat. The question was, does Milarepa see what I bring? Does he see the transmissions from India, the ones he himself said could not be retrieved? Does he see that I have given him things Gampopa could not have given him? He did not ask this question aloud. The fact that he did not ask it was also, in its way, a kind of asking. It was Milarepa who broke the silence, as Milarepa had a tendency to do, not by addressing the question directly, but by arriving at Rinpoche's cave one afternoon without announcement, settling himself against the rock as though he had always been there, and beginning to speak about something apparently unrelated. He told a story about a river he had once crossed in spring. The water had been running fast with snowmelt, and there was a flat stone midstream where the water divided around it. On one side of the stone, the current was swift and visible and made a great noise against the bank. On the other side, the water had found a longer way around, slower, quieter, without the visible drama of the near bank. And both channels, he said, reached the same valley below. Rinpoche listened. He said nothing. Milarepa was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have been watching the near bank." Rinpoche said nothing. Milarepa said, "You count what you have brought. The transmissions from Tifupa, the Dakini teachings that were not here before you went to find them. You count these, and then you look at what Gampopa has built, and you count that too, and you decide something is unequal." Rinpoche said, "I am not." Milarepa said, "Not unkindly. You have been doing this since your second journey to India. I have watched you do it. The shame of being seen was immediate and specific, not the general shame of having failed, but the more particular shame of having been seen doing something you believed you were concealing." He had the impulse to defend himself, which he recognized as the wrong impulse, and beneath it, another impulse to apologize, which was also wrong, and beneath both of them, something older and more honest relief. The relief of a person who has been carrying something unexamined and has finally had it named. Rinpoche said, "And you think I am wrong to notice the difference?" Milarepa said, "I think you are comparing your channel to his channel and calling yours lesser because it is quieter. But the quieter water, Rinpoche." He paused, and his voice shifted into the register he used when he was not making a point, but simply describing what was true. The quieter water is carrying the teachings that the near bank cannot carry. It goes where the rushing water cannot go. It reaches the valley by a different path. And what it deposits there is different, and the valley needs both. Rinpoche sat with this. Outside the cave, the wind moved through the high pass in its constant, low register, the sound of a place that is too old to hurry. He had heard this wind for years and never heard it this way before. He said, "But how do I know this is not a consolation you are offering me?" And Milarepa looked at him with the expression Rinpoche had seen once or twice before. Not amusement and not impatience, but the precise, unsentimental compassion of someone who has been where you are and knows exactly how long it takes to leave. He said, "The valley does not ask the water to prove its path. It receives what arrives. Your practice receives what you have earned. Gampopa's practice receives what he has earned. The valley is not keeping score." Rinpoche was quiet for a long time after that. The light had shifted in the way it shifted in the early afternoon at this altitude. Not dimmer, only different in angle, less direct, as though the light were now coming from a new position it had moved to while they were talking. He said, "Finally, I have spent 3 years measuring." Milarepa said, "You have. Now stop." He said it the way you would say you have been carrying that stone. "Now, put it down." There was no cruelty in it and no gentleness. Only accuracy. Rinpoche sat in his cave for 3 days after Milarepa left. He did not meditate, particularly. He simply sat, which is a different thing, and the sitting gradually became something closer to rest, which is different again. The first day the old argument kept returning that he had earned something, that the earnings should be visible, that the invisibility of his work was itself a kind of injustice. The second day the argument was quieter. It still came, but it came the way a sound comes from a distance, present, but not requiring a response. The third day he noticed that in the spaces between the argument, there was something that felt almost like spaciousness. Not resolution, not peace, exactly. Only room. Room where the measurement used to be. On the 4th morning he woke before the bell and went to the cave entrance and looked out at the valley below, where the river ran through its channel in the early light, and the near bank made its noise, and the far channel moved in its quieter way, and both of them were water, and both of them were going the same direction, and neither of them was behind. He went back in and sat down and began to practice. Not better than before, not worse. Simply himself, in his channel, at his pace, going where his particular water went. He became, in time, one of the transmitters of teachings that would otherwise have been lost, a lineage thread that ran alongside Gampopa's great institutional river and carried, through smaller passages, things that the main current could not hold. The students who came to him came not because he was the greater teacher, but because he was the necessary one, the one who held what was his to hold, who moved at the pace that was his to move, who arrived in the valley exactly as he was going to arrive. Let that find its own resting place in you. The mind that compares is the mind that is trying to protect you. It tells you, look at the near bank. See how visible it is. See how it makes its presence known. And then it turns to whatever channel you are moving in and says, why are you so quiet? Why can no one hear you from the road? But the water does not choose its channel. It finds where it is received. It moves through the landscape that opens to it, and it arrives where it arrives. And what it deposits, this is the thing you may not be able to see yet. What it deposits is exactly what that particular valley needs. Think of a time when you were doing something that only you could do. Not something recognized. Not something that earned comment or approval. Something small and specific. A way you notice things. A particular care you bring to a task that most people move through without stopping. In that moment, you were not behind. You were so fully yourself that the question of position did not arise. The valley is not keeping score. You may not yet know what you are carrying. Most people who are carrying something essential do not know it yet. They are too busy noticing the noise of the near bank, the visible current, the one that moves fast and makes itself known, the one you can point to from the road and say, "Look how much it is doing." The quieter water is already in the valley. It has been there longer than the noise. Let the hands rest now. Whatever they have been holding can be set down for a moment. Not permanently, only for this breath, this body, this particular moment in the dark where you are already enough to simply be here. The valley receives what arrives. It does not ask the water to justify its path. It does not ask the quiet channel to be louder, or the slow current to arrive before it is ready. It is receiving you now, as you are, where you are. Nothing about tonight's stillness is falling behind. The stillness is the channel. The channel is yours. Rechungpa's channel ran for decades after Milarepa was gone. It ran quietly, as it had always run, carrying what it carried into places the larger current could not reach. And when the students who received those teachings passed them on, they passed them into still smaller channels, and those channels reached further into the valleys than anyone had planned, and eventually into languages and centuries that Rechungpa could not have imagined from his cave above the mountain. The quiet water is not behind. It is already where it is going. And so are you, already moving, already carrying what you carry, already depositing what only you can deposit in the valley that is yours. Let the breath move now, in its own rhythm, through the body that is yours alone, different from every body that has ever breathed, arriving here, tonight, exactly on time, and somewhere still further north, where the cold was not the damp cold of high mountain passes, but the flat, ancient cold of wide steppe, a cold that had no feature in it to block the wind, that simply accepted the wind as part of its nature. A trader's daughter had spent most of her life believing she had been born into the wrong story. The steppe in early winter did not soften gradually. It simply one morning, from a thing that permitted movement to a thing that did not, and the grasses that had bent all autumn in the wind now stood in the particular rigid stillness of cold that has decided to stay. The sound of the wind across open steppe was different from the sound of wind through a mountain pass or a river valley. It was a note sustained at a single pitch for as long as the wind lasted, which was often the whole day, and sometimes the whole night. The low, even sound of something vast and indifferent moving across something equally vast. The entrance of the working tent, when the felt flap was pulled aside, showed a rectangle of sky, the color of old bone, a gray with no warmth in it, no suggestion of blue, and the cold that came through that entrance settled on the back of the hands and on the back of the neck with the specific insistence of a cold that intends to stay, carrying with it the smell of the open steppe, a clean, faintly mineral smell, the smell of a place where there is nothing between the ground and the sky. The tent that Choiji Odsa worked in sat at the edge of a winter encampment where the felt walls had been tripled against the cold, and the central fire burned dried dung and occasionally a piece of hardwood that someone had carried many days' distance to have. The light inside was amber and constant, the kind of light that does not flicker unless someone opens the entrance. And the smell was of the fire, and of the damp wool of the felt, and of the particular ink that Choiji Odsa had developed for writing in cold weather, a slightly thicker preparation than the summer formulation, made to move through a brush tip that the cold would otherwise stiffen. He was 61 years old. in the year that the Mongol court at Karakoram had finally begun to take a serious interest in the texts he had been translating for the better part of 3 decades. 61 was not old among monks, but it was the age at which a man who had worked as long as he had begins to understand, with an accuracy that younger men cannot access, exactly how much he has done and how much remains undone. It was also the age, he had discovered, at which the comparisons become louder rather than quieter, not because the heart grows smaller with age, but because the time remaining feels more finite, and finitude makes the distance between what is complete and what is not feel more urgent than it did at 30. Choiji Otsa had been born in the year the Mongol armies were still expanding westward, into a world that did not yet know what it was becoming. His mother had been a trader's wife from a clan near what the Chinese called the northern border, and his father had been briefly a soldier before an injury sent him back to the encampments for good. Neither of them had been particularly religious. They observed the shamanic rites of the seasons without great feeling and burned the appropriate offerings at the appropriate times. But there had been a Tibetan lama who wintered near their encampment when Choiji Otsa was 7. And the lama had recognized something in the boy's capacity for memorization and offered to teach him. He had been translating ever since. Not only translating, he was also a teacher, a commentator, a man to whom other monks brought difficult passages they could not resolve, but the work that defined him, the work that he thought about when he thought about what he had done with the time he had been given, was the translation work. Taking a teaching that existed in Tibetan or Sanskrit and finding in the Mongolian language that had no literary tradition, no settled vocabulary for spiritual concepts, no inherited way of saying what the Dharma needed to say, finding the way to carry it across. The work had taken everything he had. It had taken the years when other scholars were building reputations at court, accumulating students, establishing the kind of visible presence that made them known beyond the encampments. He had been in his tent. He had been lifting a brush tip over an inkstone and listening, not to the tent's sounds, not to the fire's sounds, but to the space between two languages, to the place where the meaning lived that neither language could fully hold. He did not regret this, but he was aware, in his 61st year, of what the work had cost and what it had not yet produced, and the awareness had a specific texture to it, in those winter months, that was close to sorrow without quite being sorrow. The problem he had been turning over in his mind for several years now, the problem that the young woman who arrived at the winter encampment had nothing to do with, and yet had everything to do with, was this: one of the other scholars at court had completed his own translation of a text that Choiji Otsa had been working on for 9 years. The other scholar was younger. He had worked quickly, with the directness of someone for whom efficiency was itself a form of respect for the material. His translation was finished, and it was, by the standards of technical accuracy, correct. 9 years against the younger scholars too. Choiji Otsa had begun his version in a different encampment, in a summer that now felt like a different life. He had chosen the hard path, the one that required not only accurate rendering but something more: the capacity of the Mongolian words to carry not just the meaning, but the weight of the meaning, the particular quality of attention that the original teaching invited in its reader. He had discarded full drafts twice. He had spent entire weeks on single phrases, testing them against his memory of how Tibetan practitioners actually spoke the words, the pauses they left, the things they did not say. Whether this had been wisdom or self-indulgence, whether the listening he had been doing was the work itself, or a way of avoiding completing the work, was a question he could not answer from the inside. The question that had settled into his chest and stayed there was whether his own version, when he finally finished it, would be recognizably different enough to matter. The young woman's name was Narantsetseq, which meant sunflower, and she was the daughter of a trader who had business with the encampment for the winter months. She had arrived with her father's caravan, carrying dried goods from the southern routes, and had shown no interest in the marketplace or the social rhythms of the camp. Only, from the second day of her arrival, in the tent where the translation work happened, she had been sitting near the entrance of the working tent for 2 days before Choiji Odsa noticed her in the particular way he noticed things, not merely registered, but actually saw. She was not a student. She was not seeking instruction. She was watching the work the way someone watches a fire, with the kind of attention that does not require understanding in order to be genuine. She was watching the brush move and stop and move again. The long pauses. The moments when Choiji Odsa set down the brush and looked at nothing for a long time. The way the completed line looked different from the attempted line that came before it. He asked what she was looking for. She said, with the directness that the steppe people considered ordinary, "I am trying to understand how you know which words to use when there are no words." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I have watched you stop many times, with the brush lifted. You are not resting. You are deciding. I want to know how you decide." This was not the question he had expected. It was. He realized as she asked it, the exact question he had been failing to answer for himself. He set down the brush. He said, "Come back tomorrow morning and I will try to show you." She came back. He took her through a single passage from the Bodhicariavatara, a text on the practice of awakening that he had been working into Mongolian for months, a text about which the other scholar's completed version sat on his desk like a quiet accusation. He showed her the Tibetan word, and then the Sanskrit beneath it, and then the 3 Mongolian options he had identified, and why none of them were exactly right, and why he was going to choose the one he was going to choose anyway. She listened with the full body stillness of someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than trying to appear to understand. Then she said, "The other one does not do this. The other scholar's version. I have seen it." He chose the first word and kept moving. Choiji Odsa was quiet for a moment. He said his version is accurate. She said, "I know, but when I read it, I do not feel the thing the passage is describing. I feel the surface of it. Yours," she gestured at the half-finished page, "yours goes underneath." He did not know what to do with this. He had been so concerned with the question of whether his version would be different enough to matter that he had not considered the possibility that the difference was already there, already in the work, already visible to someone who could read, not the Tibetan, which she could not, but the quality of attention that the translated words carried. He put the brush down. He looked at the half-finished page, and then at the other scholar's completed version on the corner of the desk, and then back at his own work. He had been seeing these as 2 versions of the same thing, one finished and one not. He understood now that he had been wrong about the category. They were not 2 versions. They were 2 different things, made for 2 different kinds of reading, by 2 different qualities of attention, for 2 different needs that were equally real. He said, almost to himself, "I have been comparing the journey to the destination." Narantsetseq said nothing. She had the wisdom of the young, which is the wisdom of not responding when a response would diminish what has just been understood. He said the other translation will be read. Mine will also be read. They are not competing for the same reader. The reader who needs a map will use his. The reader who needs the place will find mine. I have been worrying about a problem that does not exist. She said nothing. She looked at the page. Then she looked at him. He picked up the brush. He held it over the ink for a long moment without speaking. Not the hesitation of someone who does not know what to do, but the pause of someone who is about to do something they have known for a long time and are finally ready to begin. It took him a long time, which was usual. When it was finished, it was right, which was also usual, though it never felt less than surprising. He continued in this way for 11 more years, until the translation was complete. The version was still read in certain monasteries and teaching circles 8 centuries later, not as a curiosity but as a working text, not because it was earlier or more authoritative, but because it had been made by someone who had refused to stop listening to what the words wanted to say. Let that move through you now, slowly. You have been measuring the work. You have been looking at what someone else has finished, what they have completed, published, sent into the world, had received, and you have looked at what you have, which is still in process, still moving towards something whose final shape you cannot yet see, and you have decided this comparison is telling you something true. It is telling you something, but it may not be what you think it is telling you. The work that takes longer because it is going deeper is not behind. The words feel different. What the faster work produces and what the slower work produces are not 2 versions of the same thing. They are different things, made for different kinds of need, for different readers who are already looking for what each one offers. Both are necessary. Neither is competing with the other for the same space in the world. The reader who needs you is coming, not the reader who needs the one who finished first. The reader who needs the particular quality of attention that only you have been giving, the listening that looks like slowness from the outside but is actually depth. That reader cannot find what they need anywhere else. You are not behind. You are in the listening. Think of something you have spent a long time with, a relationship, a skill, a way of being in the world that you have dismissed as too slow, as evidence that you are not moving at the right pace. Consider that it might look exactly like slowness from the outside and be something else entirely from the inside. The listening that looks like delay, the depth that looks like difficulty, the long, patient attention that the surface cannot distinguish from hesitation, but that you, in your own hands, in your own way of working, know is not hesitation at all. It is the thing itself, happening in the time it takes. Let the hands be heavy now. Let them settle. They have been doing the slow work, even when the slow work felt like no work at all. That is what slow work feels like from the inside. It does not feel like work. It feels like waiting. But the waiting has been working the whole time, in the place below the surface where the real translation happens. The reader who needs a map will find a map. You are not making a map. You are making the place. He continued in this way for 11 more years, until the translation was complete. He did not work quickly in those years. He could not have worked quickly without producing something different from what he was producing. And producing something different was not something he was willing to do. The comparison with the other scholars' version faded gradually, not because he stopped being aware of it, but because the work itself stopped leaving room for it. When you are fully in the listening, there is no distance to measure. You are only inside the thing, moved by a kind of attention that is closer to love than to industry. Narensetseg left with her father's caravan the following morning. She did not say goodbye in any formal way. She looked at the desk as she passed, at the half-finished page, and then at him, and nodded once, and went into the cold. He picked up the brush. He held it over the ink for a long moment, in the pause of someone who is about to do something they have known for a long time and are finally ready to begin. Then he wrote the next line. The version was still read in teaching circles many generations later, not as a curiosity, but as a working text, not because it was earlier or more authoritative, but because it had been made by someone who had refused to stop listening to what the words wanted to say. There were readers who needed a map and used the other translation, and there were readers who needed to be in the place, and for them, this version was the only one that did what they needed. Both were necessary. Neither was behind. Let the chest soften now. Whatever has been held there for this night, whatever comparison, whatever measure of distance between where you are and where you think you should be, let it have a little less hold on the breath. The breath does not need the comparison in order to move. It moves regardless, in the rhythm that has always been yours, carrying what it carries, in exactly the time it takes, arriving where it arrives. The listening is the work. The work is already happening, somewhere further south, where the seasons turned more slowly and the rivers ran through wide valleys full of water. A woman had been standing at the edge of a decision for 3 years, not because she did not know the answer, because she had been watching others arrive at their answers more quickly, and she had taken their speed as information about her own slowness, and the information was wrong. The rain came off the Indian Ocean in the mornings in a way that was different from the rains that came from the hills, lighter, carrying more salt than moisture, arriving not as weather, but as something the air decided to do without particular commitment. At Thotagamua, where the Vijayabha Piravena stood between a line of tall trees and the road that led down to Hikkaduwa. The morning rains left the courtyard tiles a specific shade of dark grey and made the mango trees along the southern wall drop whatever blossoms were ready to fall. The smell after the rain was of damp stone and wet leaves and something sweeter underneath, the smell of the mango flowers themselves, which were not the flowers of the mango fruit, but a smaller, less certain bloom, the flower that appears before the fruit decides whether it will come. From somewhere inside the upper walls of the Piravena, even before the rain stopped, the sound of recitation began. One voice at first, then several. The young monks practicing the Pali Suttas in the cadenced way the text required, each passage given its proper weight and pace. The sound moved through the damp morning air with an unhurriedness that was not slowness. It was the unhurriedness of something that has been repeated so many times, it knows exactly what it is. From outside the gate, standing in the road, the recitation and the rain and the smell of wet stone came together as a single texture of the morning, the Piravena's daily self announcing itself to the village that sat around it. Inside the main hall, the light came through the high openings in the upper walls and arrived on the floor in columns that moved during the day as the sun moved, the way light moves in a room that knows what it is doing. The smell was of oil lamps and old palm leaf manuscripts and the sandalwood paste used in the morning offerings, smells that had been accumulating in these walls for generations, absorbed into the stone until the stone itself seemed to produce them. Sri Rahula Thera was in his 51st year when the girl first appeared at the gate. He was the Sangharaja, the supreme head of the monastic order, the first Sri Lankan monk to hold the title, appointed by King Parakramabahu VI himself, and he had been working since before dawn on a commentary he had been composing for 3 years, a commentary that existed not because anyone had commissioned it, but because the text demanded it, because there were things in the older Pali commentaries that had not been said in Sinhala in the way they needed to be said. And he was the one who could say them, and so he was saying them. This was the quality of his attention, not arrogance about his gifts, but a very clear recognition of what they were for. He had 6 languages and an extraordinary memory and a tendency, when composing, to fall so completely into the work that monks who needed to speak with him had learned to touch his shoulder rather than call his name, because calling his name from outside the work produced no response, whereas touch brought him back immediately and completely. He also had a quality that his students found less comfortable to name. He noticed things about people before they had finished introducing themselves. Not judgments, observations. The way someone's eyes moved when they were trying to say something they could not quite say. The particular rhythm of a question that was really asking something different than what it appeared to ask. He noticed these things the way he noticed the structure of a line in an old poem, not as a skill he had developed, but as the thing his attention naturally did when it was not occupied with something else. When the gatekeeper described the girl, how she knew she would be refused and came anyway, Sri Rahula's brush slowed but did not stop. He finished the line he was on. Then he set the brush in its rest and stood. The girl came back 3 mornings in a row. Each morning she stood at the gate for as long as the gatekeeper would permit, and then went away. The gatekeeper noticed that she did not come with the urgency of someone who believes they will be received. She came with the patience of someone who has already decided something and is simply carrying it out. On the first morning she was turned away quickly. On the second morning she waited longer, and the gatekeeper, for reasons he could not have articulated, let her stand for a full half-hour in the light rain before he sent her away. On the third morning she was back before the recitation began, and the gatekeeper watched her through the gate and saw that she was listening to the sound of the suttas from inside, as though she had come partly for that, not the Piravena itself, but the sound of the Piravena doing what it did each morning. The particular texture of that sound in the damp air. On the third morning, the gatekeeper came to Sri Rahula Thera and said, "There is a girl who has been coming to the gate. She says she wants to learn to write Sinhala poetry. She knows she will be refused and she comes anyway." Sri Rahula Thera put down his brush. He said, "How old?" The gatekeeper said, "Perhaps 13, perhaps 12. Sri Rahula Thera was quiet for a moment. He said, "Bring her in and let her wait in the courtyard. I will come when I have finished this line." Her name was Kumari. She was the daughter of a farmer whose land sat at the edge of the village, and she had been composing Sinhala verses in her head since she was 8 years old, not for any audience, not because anyone had taught her how, only because the words arranged themselves when she walked in the fields, and the arrangements were too complete to let go. She had no way to write them down and no language for what she was doing except the one that everyone around her used. She called it thinking out loud, which was what everyone called it, and was not what it was. What it actually was, a kind of pressure that built during the day and released through the words. She noticed it first after a monsoon, walking through the field to see what the water had done to the young rice, and a line formed in her mind about the green color of the rice in standing water, and she said it to herself and felt the pressure reduce slightly, and then another line formed, and she said that one too. And by the time she had reached the edge of the field, she had something complete. 3 lines that belonged together in a way she could feel but could not explain. She told no one. She had a sense, not yet fully formed, but already present, that what she was carrying was not shared. She had walked to the Theravada gate because she needed the word for what she did, not to make it possible. It was already happening whether or not she had a word for it, but to stop wondering if it was nothing. She sat in the courtyard and waited. A monk brought her water. The mango trees along the wall were losing their early blossoms in the mild morning wind, each flower falling at its own moment, without apparent pattern, some holding longer than others, for reasons that had nothing to do with the other flowers. When Sri Rahula Thera came, he did not sit. He stood at the edge of the courtyard and looked at her with the attention he used when he was reading something he expected to find difficult. He said, "You want to learn to compose." She said, "I already compose. I want to know if what I am doing is composing." He was quiet. This was not the answer he had expected. He said, "Recite something." She recited a verse she had made up the week before while walking behind her father's ox. It was about the way the evening light looked on the paddy fields, the specific greenness of the young rice in late afternoon, the way it seemed to give back more light than it received. She recited it the way she had been carrying it, without ornamentation, with the rhythm she had found in the field. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Come again tomorrow." She came the next day, and every day after that, and he did not invite her inside, and did not offer her the formal instruction that the boys inside the walls received. What he did instead was this. Each morning he gave her one thing, sometimes a line from an older poem, sometimes a question about language. Sometimes he read her one of his own compositions and asked what she heard in it. He watched the quality of her attention when he gave her these things. It was not the attention of someone trying to learn correctly. It was the attention of someone recognizing something. The way a person's face changes when they hear a sound they have been hearing all their lives but have never before had a word for. Each thing he offered her was not new information. It was confirmation of something she already knew but had not had permission to call real. He said nothing about this observation. A teacher who names what is happening in the student before the student is ready to hear it named does not speed the learning. He stops it. What was needed here was not explanation. It was occasion. He was providing the occasions. She was doing the rest herself, which was the only way it could happen. He did not recite her verse to his students or reference her in his teaching. He did not record that she came. The visits existed in the space between what the Theravada officially did and what he was permitted to offer a girl who could not be invited inside. But the space was real, and he inhabited it without apology. The day that changed her was the day he read her a katha, a short verse about a mango flower falling from a branch in the morning. The flower falls while other flowers are still on the branch. The flower does not fall because it is deficient. It falls because it is finished with being a flower and is beginning to become something else, the place where a fruit might appear, or might not. But either way, the flower has done what a flower does. He read it once and said, "What do you see?" She said, "The flower is sad." He said, "Read it again inside yourself." She did. She said, "The flower is early." He said once more. She said, "The other flowers are watching." He was quiet. The courtyard was quiet. A bird moved in one of the mango trees. He said once more. She held the verse inside her for a long time. Then she said, slowly, "The flower doesn't know any of that. It just falls." He looked at her. He said, "Yes." She said, "But that seems too simple." He said, "The simple answer is almost always the one that took the longest to arrive at." Then he said, "Now you know what composing is. You have been doing it for years. You will continue to do it. Whether or not you do it inside these walls is a different question, and not the most important one." She sat with this. The morning rain had stopped, and the courtyard tiles were beginning to dry at their edges. The mango blossoms that had fallen were on the ground in small groups, where the wind had moved them, pale and complete, having been exactly what they were for exactly as long as they needed to be. She came back the following week and the week after that, and Sri Rahula never invited her formally into the Piravana and never refused to see her when she came. He gave her one thing, each visit, a question, a line, a way of listening to the language that she had been using without knowing how to listen to it. Over months, she learned to distinguish between the verse she made in the field and the verse that had been finished in the field, and to trust the difference. She learned that the composing happened when she stopped trying to compose, and that the trying was not wasted. It cleared the ground for what came after. She learned something else too, though she would not have words for it until she was much older, that being outside the wall had not, in the end, been a lesser position. The monks inside received everything in sequence, through a structure that left nothing to find on your own. What Kumari had received, in fragments, in a courtyard, from a man who could not formally teach her, had required her to complete it herself. The incompleteness was not a deprivation. It was the form her education took, and the form had given her something the formal structure might not have the ability to recognize what she knew by finding it rather than by being told it. She did not know, sitting in that courtyard, that she was receiving a version of education that was, in at least one way, more demanding than the one the boys inside were getting. She only knew that each thing Sri Rahula gave her settled into a place that felt like it had always been waiting for that particular thing. The verses she carried home, she never showed anyone, but they changed the way she moved through the village, and the people around her noticed the change without knowing its cause, which is what happens when a person begins to inhabit their own capacity more fully. They are not different. They are simply more themselves, in a way that the people nearest to them can feel but cannot name. Let what just happened in that courtyard have a little more room in you now. You may have been waiting for permission, not formal permission, not a ceremony, not a credential, not a gate that finally opens, but some internal permission, some sense that what you are doing has been recognized and confirmed by someone who knows, before you allow yourself to fully believe that it is real. Here is what Sri Rahula told Kumari, and what he is telling you now. Through the shape of that story, the composing is already happening. The recognition comes after, and the recognition is not the point. It is not what makes the composing real. What makes it real is that you have been doing it for years, quietly, without anyone to name it for you. You have been doing the thing that is yours to do. You have been waiting for confirmation that never came, and taking its absence as information. But the absence of confirmation is not the same as absence of the thing itself. The flower in the courtyard did not wait for anyone to notice it before it opened. It opened because the opening was what it was doing, in its own time, in its own way, for reasons that had nothing to do with who was watching. The thing you do quietly is real. Let the arms be heavy now. Let them rest. Think of something you have been doing quietly, without recognition, without being sure it counts. Some way you show up, some quality of attention you bring, something you make or tend to or return to in the ordinary moments of your life. It is real. It has been real the whole time you have been doing it. The confirmation you have been waiting for was never the source of its realness. You were always the source of its realness. The flower does not know any of that. It just falls. In the morning, in the particular moment that is its own. And the falling is not a performance, not for the other flowers, not for the tree. It is only the flower completing what it began when it opened. The confirmation you were waiting for, it was never the point. The flower does not need to be seen to fall. The breath knows this. It has always known. Let it move now, without direction, in the rhythm that is yours, unhurried, complete, belonging entirely to this moment and no other. Feel the surface beneath you. Whatever holds you tonight, you are held. You do not have to earn the holding. And somewhere across the water, on an island further north where the winters were harder and the language of practice was different, but the ache of the question was the same. A man had been trying for many years to outrun his own shadow. The road to Ralong came through a pass that held its snow until late in the spring, and then released it suddenly, all at once, so that the path became a river for 3 weeks before it became a path again. Below the pass, the monastery sat against the mountain in the way that very old buildings sit against mountains, not placed there, but grown there. The stone of the walls taking on the coloring of the stone around it over the centuries, so that from a distance the whole structure looked less like a building and more like an emergence, something the mountain had decided to produce. The sound that reached travelers before they could see the monastery clearly was the sound of water, snowmelt running through the stone channels built into the walls, a sound that had been continuous for longer than anyone living could remember. The sound of altitude and patience combined into something that was neither. Inside the teaching hall, the smell was of butter lamps and old brocade, and the particular dryness that high altitude produces in wool and in the paper of old manuscripts, a dryness that had nothing of brittleness in it. It was the dryness of something preserved, something that had been kept from the particular dampness that destroys. Pema Karpo was in his 58th year when Dorje came to him with the letter. He was the 4th Gyalwang Drukpa, the head of the Drukpa lineage, a scholar whose 24 volumes of writings on philosophy, history, and practice had already been circulated to monasteries from Bhutan to Ladakh. He had been called the most learned Lama of his age, a comparison that was not merely flattery. The 5th Dalai Lama himself later said that Pema Karpo's scholarship was comparable to his own. He composed histories, commentaries, and treatises on Mahamudra that monks would be studying centuries after his death. He was also a man who could sit with a student for 3 hours saying nothing, in the particular way that people who are genuinely comfortable with silence sit with it, not as an exercise, not as a teaching technique, but as the natural texture of a mind that is not in a hurry. Dorje had arrived at Ralong 6 months earlier, from a community 2 days' walk to the south, with a letter of introduction from a teacher who said Dorje was gifted and serious and would benefit from instruction at the monastery's advanced level. What the letter of introduction did not say, what Dorje himself could not have told you because he had not yet found the words for it, was that Dorje had spent his entire life being the most capable person in every room he entered, and had arrived at Ralong and discovered, for the first time, that he was not. He had come to his practice young and had advanced quickly, quicker than his teachers expected, quicker than the other boys in his community. He had a particular way of absorbing things, not by trying to remember them, but by feeling the shape of them, and the shape stayed. His teachers had said, With the particular admiration that early talent produces, this one will go far. He had heard this many times. He had, without meaning to, built a small but very solid structure out of those words and had been living inside it for years, without being fully aware that the structure was the thing he was living in. The structure was this: I am someone who moves faster than others. I understand things more readily. This is what I am, and it has always been true. Ray Lung had not destroyed this understanding. It had simply introduced him to people for whom it was not true, people who moved at their own pace, in their own season, with their own particular way of knowing things. And the introduction had produced something unexpected, not humility, which he could have worked with, but a specific and persistent bewilderment. He did not know who he was if he was not the fastest. There were students at Ralung who had been there longer than Dorje and who moved through the teachings with a fluency that Dorje could not replicate. Not yet. There were students who had arrived after him and who seemed to understand things in a single hearing that Dorje required 3 or 4 hearings to absorb. He sat with this disparity each morning in the teaching hall and tried to apply the practices he was supposedly learning. Practices about non-attachment, about releasing the self's desperate need to measure and compare, and found, each morning, that the practices did not apply to themselves. You could understand the principle of not comparing and still compare. You could hold the doctrine and still feel the ache. The ache had a specific texture. It arrived most clearly in the teaching sessions when Pema Karpo asked a question and the student to Dorje's left answered before Dorje had finished forming the thought. It arrived when he saw the margin notes in another student's manuscript, clear, confident, placed with the sureness of someone who knew exactly what they were noticing. It arrived when he sat in meditation and felt, not peace, not even the beginning of peace, but only the same restless assessment he brought to everything. Am I doing this correctly? Am I at the stage I should be at? Is this what it is supposed to feel like? Or have I missed something? He had tried to talk to one of the more advanced students about this. The student had listened and then said, in a way that was probably meant to be kind, "You are very new here. Give it time," which was not wrong, but was not, in the particular way that correct advice is not what you need, what he needed. The letter he had written to Pema Karpo the night before was not, in the cold morning light, a document he was proud of. It had been composed in the hour when everything feels worst, when the mind's tendency towards self-criticism has run for so long unchecked that it has produced a kind of document, a formal accounting of insufficiency. He had written that he thought he was not progressing at the pace the other students were progressing. He had written that he was considering returning home, because there was no point in continuing if what he was producing was so clearly inferior to what others were producing. He had written some things that were, in the morning, recognizable as unkind, not to Pema Karpo, but to himself, in a way that seemed important to document, because he wanted someone to agree with his low assessment so that he could stop carrying the uncertainty of not knowing if it was accurate. He brought the letter to Pema Karpo in the morning, before the teaching. He expected to be told that he was wrong, or right, or to be given a specific practice to address the problem. He expected to be met directly, because in his experience teachers met things directly. Pema Karpo took the letter. He held it for a moment without opening it. Then, he folded it carefully along the crease Dorje had made and set it on the low table beside him. He said, "On your walk here this morning, did you pass the pear tree in the eastern garden?" Dorje had not noticed a pear tree. He said, "I am not sure." Pema Karpo said, "It is the one that grows closest to the water channel." It has not produced fruit for the past 2 years. The monks who tend the garden have been watching it very carefully, but they have not removed it. Dorje waited for the rest. Pema Karpo said, I asked the head gardener once why they kept it. He said, it is a pear tree. Pear trees fruit when they fruit. We are not in a hurry, and neither is the tree. A silence held itself in the space between them. Dorje said, you are saying I am like the tree. Pema Karpo said, I am saying the monks are not removing the tree. Dorje sat with this. It was not, in one sense, what he had wanted. He had wanted to be told where he stood. He had wanted a measurement, to a position, some information about whether the gap between him and the other students was a real gap or a perceived one. What he had received instead was a comparison that said nothing about gaps and positions, and still said something he could feel in the center of his chest, something he could not yet name. He said, how do I know if I am progressing at all? Pema Karpo said the tree does not know if it is progressing. It is not a question the tree is capable of asking. The question you are asking is a mind question. The progress is a body question. They do not use the same measuring instrument. Dorje said, how do I stop asking the mind question? Pema Karpo looked at him with the directness of someone who has been asked a question they have been asked many times before, and who gives the same answer each time, not because they have run out of alternatives, but because the same answer is still the right answer. He said, you do not stop asking it. You notice that you are asking it, and you return to the practice. Many times, the question will come and you will return. Eventually, the returning becomes more familiar than the asking. A silence held the room. Outside, the snow melt continued in its stone channels. Dorje said, and that is enough. Pema Karpo said, what would enough look like to you? Dorje opened his mouth and closed it. He had not expected the question to be returned to him in that form. He sat with it. He thought about what enough would look like and realized, slowly, that he had never asked himself this. He had only asked himself what insufficient looked like, and had a very detailed answer to that question. He could describe his insufficiency precisely, in 6 specific ways, and had no answer at all to this one. He said, slowly, I don't know. Pema Karpo nodded. He said, that is a beginning. He picked up the letter from the table. He set it in front of Dorje. He said, read what you have written again, tomorrow morning, when you have slept. Dorje took the letter. He left without understanding what had just happened, which was, in some ways, the point. The things that change something in you are rarely the things that announce themselves as changes. They are more often the things that happen in the space between a question and an answer that does not quite answer the question, in the way that a tree in a garden can simply continue to exist without producing fruit. And this continuation is not a failure and is not a success, but is something that does not fit inside either of those categories, something that requires a different kind of looking altogether. He read the letter the next morning. He saw in it something he had not seen the night before, not his inadequacy, but his urgency, the urgency to arrive, to produce, to be seen to be producing, to have something to show for the time he had been given. He read the phrases he had written about the other students' progress and saw that each one was not an observation about those students, but a story about himself, about the gap between where he was and where he believed he should be, which was a gap entirely produced by the belief. He sat with the letter for a long time. He did not feel better. Exactly. He felt different, the way a room feels different when someone opens a window. Not warmer or cooler necessarily, but as though the air itself has changed its relationship to the space. He went to the teaching hall. He listened to Pema Karpo speak about the nature of mind's tendency to grasp, how the grasping and the comparing arise from the same root, the root of believing that the self can be made more secure by measuring its position relative to other selves. He had heard this teaching before. He had understood it before, in the way you understand things before they have changed anything. This morning he heard it in a different register, not as information but as description. Not of a principle, but of what he had been doing. Of what he had been doing for years without knowing he was doing it. The shift was not dramatic. It did not feel like arrival. But in the teaching session, he asked one fewer question than usual, and he noticed that the silence he left where the question would have been was not empty. It had something in it. Something that arrived when the urgency temporarily stopped generating questions to fill the space. He sat in the teaching hall that morning and listened to Pema Karpo speak about the nature of mind. And something in the listening was different from what it had been the day before. Not the content of the listening, the quality of it, as though a door had opened slightly in the chest, and through the opening came something that was not understanding, not resolution, not peace exactly, only air, only a small amount of additional space for the breath to move through. He would lose the space later that day, and recover it, and lose it again, and recover it again. But the recovering became slightly faster each time, which was the only kind of progress available to him right now, and which was, he was beginning to understand. Enough. Let that space have a moment to work. You have been writing the letter, not with a brush, not on a page, but inside yourself, composing the accounting of what you have not yet done, of how far you are from where you intended to be by now, of what the others seem to have found that you have not found, of what this says about you. The accounting is not false. The distances are real, but the measure you are using is not the only measure available, and it is not, this is the thing. It is not the measure the tree uses. The tree in the Eastern garden does not know it is late. It does not know that it did not fruit last year. It is simply being a pear tree. In this winter, in this soil, in this particular relationship with the water channel that runs beside it, receiving what the season gives, offering what it can offer, without a story about what this means about it as a tree. You have a story. Stories are how the mind makes sense of time. But the story you are telling yourself tonight is one version of many possible stories, and it is not the most accurate one. It is the version composed in the hour when everything feels like evidence of something bad. It is the urgency version, the deadline version, the I have not yet version. There is another version. The version in which what you have done is what you have done, in which the returning to the breath is itself the practice, not the preparation for the practice, in which you do not have to have arrived by morning. The tree is not going to be removed. Let the shoulders drop now. They have been holding something that did not need to be held. The mind question will come again. It always comes again. But each time it comes, you can notice it and return to the breath. And the return is not defeat, it is the practice. The practice is the returning. Every time, as many times as the question comes, you do not have to stop the question. You only have to notice it and come back. The breath is moving now. Without your instruction, it has always known its pace. It does not compare itself to anyone else's breath. It simply moves, in the rhythm that is yours, in the season that is yours, arriving exactly where it arrives, which is here, which is enough. which has always been enough, even in the nights when the accounting made it hard to feel that. Feel the air moving now. Feel it reaching further into the chest with each breath. A little more room. A little more space. This is not effort. This is what happens when the accounting stops for one breath, and then another, and the body, finding the space, takes it. And somewhere still further to the west, where the mountains were older and the passes lower, and a different language held the teachings, a woman had been standing at the edge of something she was afraid to name, because naming it might make it real, and might make it hers, and she was not sure she was ready to carry what was hers. The Sargang Hills rose on the western bank of the Irrawaddy with the particular quality of hills that have been preyed on for so long they seem to have absorbed the practice into their stone. From the river, in the early morning, you could hear the bells of dozens of monasteries at different intervals and pitches, the way a forest produces many bird calls at once, not chaotic, but layered, each one distinct, and each one part of something larger than itself. The hillside was terraced with whitewashed stupas that caught the light as the sun lifted over the eastern bank, so that the whole slope seemed, for a half hour each morning, to be producing its own illumination from within. The sound closest to the path, not the bells but underneath them, was the sound of the wind in the large trees that grew along the lower slopes. A sound like a very slow exhalation, as though the hill itself was breathing at a pace too long for any single human life to complete. The smell that reached the river from the hills was of incense and of the particular dry earth smell that red laterite soil carries in the hot season, and of the frangipani trees that grew along the lower paths and shed their flowers without urgency, each blossom falling at its own moment, making no sound on the path below. Kotin arrived at the lower gate of Madawi's monastery in the early afternoon of a Tuesday in the dry season, having come from Mandalay by river and then on foot up the hillside path. The river crossing that morning had taken him past a section of the bank where the current ran shallow over stones, and he had watched, from the ferry, the way the water moved around each stone without pausing to decide, simply finding the line of least resistance and taking it. At the pace the slope allowed. He had noticed this and then forgotten it. The way you notice something when you are on your way to ask a different question. The hillside path was dusty and shaded in sections by large trees whose roots had broken through the laterite in the way of things that have been growing for longer than the path has been there. Other pilgrims passed him going down, most of them silent, some with the look of people who had received something they were still processing. The bells of the smaller stupas along the path rang at intervals that had no relationship to each other, each one sounding according to its own schedule, creating together a texture of sound that was not music but was not without order either. The way many separate lives, each moving at its own pace, can produce something that feels, from a certain distance, like harmony. He was 27 years old, the son and junior partner of a silk merchant who had a good business and expected Kotin to have a better one. Kotin's elder brother had already doubled the enterprise's reach. Kotin's younger cousin had started a separate trade in lacquerware and was doing well at it. Kotin himself was doing adequate work in the family business, which was by any reasonable measure not a failure. But adequate work in a family that produced exceptional work was its own kind of solitude, and Kotin had been living inside it for 4 years now. He was not, he would have told you, an unhappy man. He was a man who had begun, in the small hours of too many recent nights, to feel the particular weight of a life that was moving forward at precisely the pace he was capable of sustaining, and was being compared, continuously, to lives that moved faster. The comparison had a specific texture. His elder brother made decisions the way certain people swim, with an ease that suggested the medium was natural to them, that it had always been natural, that they could not understand why anyone would find it otherwise. His younger cousin had the quality of someone who arrived at things ahead of schedule, who finished his ideas before Ko Tin had finished his first sentence about the same idea. Ko Tin was not slower in any measurable sense. He completed his work. He fulfilled his obligations. He was careful in a way that produced reliable results. But careful was not the word that anyone used to describe the people he measured himself against, and reliable was not the quality that lit up a room when it walked in. He had tried, at various points, to work faster, to decide faster, to commit more quickly to directions before he had thought them through. Each time, the results had been worse than his usual approach. The faster version of himself was, apparently, not a better version, only a more harried one, making the same decisions he would have made anyway, but without the quality of attention that made them any good. He had not known what to do with this information except carry it. He had heard of Medawi from a merchant who had made the hill pilgrimage the year before and come back changed in some way that was hard to name, quieter, not diminished. Ko Tin had thought about this for months before he came. The question he had prepared to ask was this: should he leave the trading business and take robes? He had framed it differently in his head at different times, sometimes as a practical question about vocation, sometimes as a spiritual one about whether he was in the right life altogether. But it always came back to this was the life, he was living the right one, or was there another life he was supposed to be living, one that he kept missing because he was too slow, too cautious, too whatever it was that made him adequate, while others were exceptional. He had been asking some version of this question for 4 years. It had not, in 4 years, produced a useful answer. But the asking had felt like the only responsible response to not knowing. A young novice led him through the courtyard and into a small room that smelled of old teak and the remnants of morning incense. Medawi was already there, seated, working with a brush over a manuscript page in the unhurried way of a man who has long since stopped feeling that time is a limited resource. He was an older man, compact in his robes, with the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a great many years paying attention to exactly what is happening, not what might happen, not what should happen, but what is in fact occurring in this moment and the next. He looked up at Ko Tin without apparent surprise, which Ko Tin later understood was not incuriosity but its opposite. Medawi had seen so many people arrive with so many versions of the same question that the arrival of another one interested him, not less, but more. He looked up at Ko Tin with the particular directness of someone who has spent many years watching what people carry through their bodies when they think they are only carrying it in their minds. He said, "Sit." Ko Tin sat. He began to form the question he had prepared. Medawi said, "Not yet." He set down the brush. He said, "Before you tell me what you came here to ask, I want to try something with you." He gestured to Ko Tin's hands, which were resting on his thighs. He said, "Notice where your hands are touching your legs." Ko Tin looked down. Medawi said, "Not with your eyes, with your hands. What do your hands feel?" Ko Tin focused. He said, "Warmth, the fabric of the longyi." Medawi said, "Good. Now notice the breath, not the idea of the breath, the actual sensation of it, where it enters, where it is coolest, where it is warmest when it leaves. Kotin sat with this. The room was very quiet. From outside came the distant layered bells, closer now than they had been on the river, more distinct. He noticed the breath arriving at the edge of the nostrils and leaving warmer than it came, and then arriving again. He noticed that the breath had a texture, not thin, not thick exactly, but something in between, something he had never tried to notice before, because he had never tried to notice anything about it at all. It had been breathing him his whole life, and he had been elsewhere. He noticed, after a while, that he was only noticing the breath, and nothing else. Not the question he had prepared, not his brother's ease in the trade, not the younger cousin who finished his ideas first, not the particular weight he had been carrying for 4 years. These things were still there, presumably, but they had withdrawn to the edge of the room, the way furniture withdraws when the light changes, and what you notice is only the light. He sat for what felt like 10 minutes, though he could not have said for certain. Then Madawi's voice arrived from across the room. He said, "What did you just experience?" Kotin considered this seriously. He said, "I don't know how to describe it. I was only here, not thinking about anything. Just the breath." Madawi said yes. Kotin waited for more. It did not come. He said, Is that the practice?" Madawi said, "That is the beginning of the practice. What you felt just now is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something that is usually covered over by the measuring, by the comparing, by the question of whether you are where you are supposed to be." Kotin was quiet. He looked at his hands, still resting on his thighs, still warm from the contact. He said, "I came here to ask you whether I should take robes." Madawi looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" Kotin said, "Because I feel like I am falling behind in the life I am in." Madawi said, "Behind what?" Kotin opened his mouth. He closed it. The question had seemed clear before he came here. Now it was not clear who or what he was behind, only that the feeling of being behind had been so constant for so long that he had mistaken the feeling for a fact. Madawi said, "The breath does not fall behind. Each breath arrives when it arrives. It does not know about the breath that came before it or the breath that will come after. It is only this breath, in this body, in this moment, complete." Then he said, "The question of robes is a different question. But the answer to the question you actually came with, the one about falling behind, that answer you already have. You found it just now. In 10 minutes of sitting. You did not need to come all the way to the Sargang Hills for it." He paused. Then he said, in a tone that was not unkind, but was completely serious, "You could have sat anywhere." Kotin left the monastery in the late afternoon. He walked down the hillside path in the slant light that makes the laterite soil look briefly golden, among the frangipani trees, shedding their flowers with the same unhurried regularity they had shown when he came up. The bells of the various stupas sounded behind and above him as he descended, each at its own interval, the way they had sounded before he went in, but they sounded different now. Or he was hearing them differently, which produced the same result. He stopped once, halfway down, where the path opened briefly and he could see the river below. The Irrawaddy was the color of late afternoon teak in the light, wide and slow-looking from this distance, though he knew from the crossing that morning that the current was stronger than it appeared. The current did not look strong. It looked like a river doing what rivers do, at the pace that was natural to it, in the direction that had always been its direction. He did not know. Yet, whether he would stay in trade or not. That question remained open and felt, strangely, less urgent than it had, less like a failure to resolve and more like something that would resolve in its own time, when the relevant information had gathered itself sufficiently. What felt different was smaller than a decision. It was something closer to the quality of the air in the small room, the particular silence that arrived when the measuring stopped. He did not know how to produce that silence on command. He suspected it was not the kind of thing that could be produced on command, but he now knew that it existed, and that he was capable of finding it, and that it was available to him in the life he already had, not in a different life. A faster life, a life in which he had made different choices earlier, or moved with more certainty toward outcomes he could not have predicted. He walked. The river appeared below him, wide and flat, and moving at its own pace, carrying what it carried, going where it was going. He had traveled it that morning and would travel it again. It had not asked him whether he was moving fast enough. Let this be very quiet now. You have been measuring the breath, not the actual breath. The story of the breath. The idea that this particular breath, in this particular life, at this particular stage, is not quite where a breath should be by now. But the breath does not know any of that. It arrives when it arrives. It leaves when it leaves. Between the arriving and the leaving there is a moment, just a moment, when it is simply here. Simply this. Simply complete. Not faster than the breath before it. Not slower than the one coming after. Only this breath, which has never existed before and will not exist again. You could have found this anywhere. This is not a criticism. It is the thing that makes it available to you right now, in exactly the room you are in exactly the life you are living, without any changes to either. Let the belly receive the next breath, not manage it, not deepen it, just receive it. The frangipani drops its flowers at its own hour. No flower is early, no flower is late. Each one falls when it falls, and the path beneath the tree does not record which came first, does not rank them by the sequence of their falling, does not call any of them behind. You have been carrying the feeling for so long it has started to feel like accurate information. It is not information. It is only a feeling. And a feeling is not a fact about you. It is a fact about your nervous system in this season. Processing what it is processing. Doing what it does. The measuring was something you added to here. It was not here itself. And here, this moment, this breath, this body in whatever position it is in, is still here, untouched by the measuring, waiting with the patience of something that does not experience patience as effort. If sleep takes you here, that is exactly right. You do not have to follow any of this to its end. The understanding you have already received tonight does not require you to be awake for it. It is already in you, the way the breath was already in Khotin, before Madawi said a word, already moving, already complete, already belonging entirely to him. The bells of the Sagaing Hills rang at different intervals. Each bell sounded according to its own time. Together they made something that felt, from the river, like harmony, not because they agreed on the rhythm, but because each one was fully itself, and that turned out to be enough. You do not have to be different tonight. You are already what the night needs. Rest here. Feel the weight of the surface beneath you, the particular way it holds the particular shape of you, which is not the shape of anyone else. This holding has been happening all along. You were not required to earn it. The breath is here. The holding is here. You are here. That is already enough. It has always been enough. Even on the nights when the measuring made it hard to feel that, even then, it was enough. And somewhere across a very wide ocean, in a country that had a different name for the same sky, a woman had been carrying a question for decades that she had finally begun to set down, not because she had found the answer, but because she had begun to understand that the carrying itself was the thing she had been practicing, and that the practice was almost finished. The cold that came off the mountains around Kyoto in late autumn had a different quality from the cold that came earlier in the season, not sharper, but more settled, as though it had decided to stop being temporary and had arrived at something closer to permanence. From the temple bells in the valley below, the sound of the evening service carried up the hillside through the cold air. A sound that by the time it reached the small dwelling at the edge of the garden had lost most of its ceremony and become simply a sound, a low, sustained note that said, "Another day has completed itself." The persimmon tree in the garden still held some of its fruit, orange and heavy against a sky that had gone the particular dark blue of early evening in a city that burns many lights. And the air at the entrance of the room smelled of the kiln, which was cold tonight, and of pine resin from the fire inside, and of the particular clay smell that had been accumulating in the small space for the better part of a year, a smell that was not unpleasant. That was, in fact, she had gradually come to realize, the smell of a life that had found what it was for. The garden at the edge of the small dwelling where Rengetsu had been living since her father's death was not large, but it held the persimmon tree in a stone basin where the water had frozen at its edges and was beginning, in the middle hours of the night, to freeze all the way through. From inside, if you listened past the sound of the fire, you could hear the dry leaves of the persimmon moving in the wind, a sound like something being handled very carefully. The sound of objects that know their season is almost finished and are not resisting it. Rengetsu was 42 years old, and she had been doing the thing she was doing for 7 months. The thing she was doing was making pottery. She had not intended this to be her life's work. She had come to clay the way people come to the one thing remaining after the other things have been taken, not with intention but with something more like gravitation. The way water finds the lowest available path. What had been taken was this 2 husbands, all of her children, her adoptive mother and brother, and most recently her father, who had been with her through the ordination and the years after, who had sat in the early morning reading sutras across the room from her in a silence that required nothing to be added to it. She had buried people at an age when most people are still building their primary life. She had done the grieving. She was now on the other side of it, in the territory that opens after everything optional has been removed, and what remains is the essential, which in her case was her own hands, and the mourning, and the prayers that had become, over the years of repetition, less like addresses to something outside herself, and more like the sound her own mind made when it was gathered and still. What remained was herself. Herself, in a small dwelling in Kyoto, with access to a kiln and hands that had not been idle since she was a girl learning calligraphy at Kamioka Castle, hands that had trained in martial arts and arranged flowers and handled brushes and never, in all those years, been still for long. The poems had been with her the entire time. This was the part that was hardest to explain. Even to herself, she had been carrying poems since she was a girl, The way you carry something you have nowhere to put yet. At Kameoka, learning the waka forms from a teacher who said she had an unusual quality of attention, she had begun accumulating observations, the way the evening light changed the color of the water in the garden basin, the sound of the castle bell through rain, the particular feeling of a poem that had finished itself before you had finished writing it. She had kept them in her, these poems, through the marriages and the children and the deaths, because there was no other place to keep them, and they did not seem to belong to the life that was happening around her. And so they stayed inside, where they grew more complete and more restless as the years passed. After he died, she had nothing left to lose and nowhere particular to go, which was, she had come to understand, slowly, over many months, a kind of freedom she had not been able to imagine from inside the life that preceded it. The people she had loved were gone. The life she had been living was gone. What remained was the mourning, and her hands, and the open question of what to do with them. She had begun making pottery because she needed to eat, and because her hands needed something to do, and because the women at the temple where she had been staying had given her access to the kiln. The first pieces had been poor. She knew they were poor without needing to be told. The clay did not do what she intended. The walls were uneven in ways that felt like failure rather than character. The proportions were wrong in ways she could feel in her hands, but could not correct because she did not yet understand what she was doing well enough to understand what she was doing wrong. She had set them aside and made more, and the more had been slightly less poor, and the slightly less poor had been set aside too, and she had continued. What she had learned, over 7 months, was not primarily a skill. It was a quality of attention. The clay rewarded a certain kind of presence, not the concentration she had used for calligraphy, which was focused and somewhat muscular, but something softer and more receptive, closer to listening than to speaking. She had spent 42 years speaking. The clay was asking her to do something different. It was asking her to receive what the material was telling her about itself, where it wanted to be thick, where it wanted to be thin, where it would hold and where it would crack. She had not compared this process to the calligraphy or the poetry or the martial training or anything else she had learned. The comparison would have been useless. The clay was asking for the version of her that had not yet existed, and that version was still being made, and it would not be hurried. What had happened, over 7 months of this, was not improvement exactly, not the kind of improvement you track, where each piece is measurably better than the last. It was more like the clay had been gradually becoming willing to be worked with her instead of against her, as though the material had been deciding whether she was serious, and had concluded recently that she was. She was not comparing her work to anyone else's work. She was not, any longer, comparing it to what she had imagined her work might eventually become. She was only making the next piece, and the next, and letting whatever came out of the kiln be what it was. She had tried, in the earlier months, to answer the question of whether this work was good enough to sell, good enough to call her life's work, good enough to justify the choice to remain in Kyoto rather than return to a temple. She had not been able to answer the question, and had eventually stopped asking it, because the asking had no useful relation to what came out of her hands. The hands did what the hands could do. The question of whether it was enough was a different question, and one that apparently could only be answered by the person holding the finished piece, who was not her. The piece she had finished that evening was a small tea bowl, irregular in the way that her pieces were irregular. with a thickness at one side of the rim that she had tried to correct and not entirely succeeded. She had set it on the mat in front of her and looked at it for a long time. She had not known, before this evening, whether the poem and the clay would fit each other. This had been the question she had been carrying for months without articulating it, even to herself, whether the two things she knew how to do, the poetry and the making, were separate streams or a single one. She was about to find out. Then she picked up her brush. She did not plan the poem. She had poems in her, accumulated like water behind a gate, years of them. The ones she had been writing in her head since she was a girl at Kamioka Castle, learning the classical forms from a teacher who said she had an unusual quality of attention, and the ones she had continued writing through the marriages and the deaths and the ordination port, the poems that were not for anyone but had nowhere to go, the poems that had been living inside her, waiting for a form they fit. The bowl fit. She began at the rim and let the brush move where it moved. The hiragana characters she had been practicing since childhood, the curved, a flowing script that moves across a surface the way water moves, following the shape of what holds it, went around the irregular rim and down the side, fitting into the surface the way a landscape fits into its own unevenness, not despite it, but because of it. She did not correct the characters where they compressed around the thick section of the rim. She let them be compressed. The compression was part of what the bowl was. When she reached the end of the poem, she stopped. The brush was still in her hand. She looked at what she had written, the poem about the autumn moon, about how the moon appears identical each year and yet is never the same moon, and she felt, for the first time in many years, something that was not exactly happiness and was not relief, but was close to what happens when a long-held breath is finally released. The poem had been inside her for more than 20 years. The bowl had been waiting in the clay for longer than that. They had been moving toward each other across a very long time, and she happened to be the place where they arrived. When she finished, she set down the brush and looked at what she had made. It was not perfect. It was not what she would have made if she had been a more skilled potter, or a faster learner, or someone who had come to this work at 20 instead of 42. It was exactly what she could make, at this moment, with the hands she had, in the season that was hers, and inside it, going around the rim, was a poem about the autumn moon, about how the moon appears identical each year and yet is never the same moon, that had been waiting inside her for 20 years to find a place to live. She picked up the bowl and held it in both hands. It had the particular warmth that clay holds after firing, a warmth that is not the warmth of something alive, but is its own kind of warmth. The warmth of something that has been through fire and has come out of fire, changed, and is now simply what it is. She understood, holding it, that the comparison she had been carrying, the comparison between where she was and where she might have been if the losses had not happened, if she had come to the clay at 20, if the path had been less interrupted and more direct, was a comparison she had been making with a life she had not lived. And the life she had not lived was not available to her as a reference point. It was only a story she had been telling herself about a parallel life that had fewer graves in it and more time. The life she had was this, a bowl with a poem going around it, held in her hands, in a small room, in a city that was changing around her in ways she could not predict. The poem and the bowl were real. The other life was not. She set the bowl down carefully and went to bed. She made 50,000 more pieces in the years that followed. People came from the city to buy them, and then, from further away, and the pieces went to houses and collections across Japan, and eventually across the ocean. And people held them in their hands and read the poems inscribed on them and felt something they often could not name. What they were feeling, though they did not know it, was the specific quality of a life that had stopped comparing itself to other lives and had become, entirely and without apology, its own. The pieces were not all equally beautiful. Some came out of the kiln wrong and were set aside. Some were sold to people who did not particularly need a poem-inscribed bowl, but who felt, holding it, that they were holding something that had been made with complete attention, which was its own kind of gift. Rengetsu did not waste time on the question of whether any particular piece was good enough. She made the next piece. The making was the practice. The practice was the life. These three things had become indistinguishable from each other, which is what happens when you stop comparing what you are doing to what else you might be doing and simply do it, with everything you have, in the season you are in. Rengetsu died at 84, in the same simple room where she had worked for 10 years. Her last piece is held in a museum now. It is a small sake flask with a poem about the winter moon, about how the moon does not hurry the cold, and the cold does not hurry the moon, and between them the night does what the night has always done. She had not come to the clay at 20. She had come at 42, with 42 years of accumulated attention, accumulated loss, accumulated poems that had nowhere to go. The bowl that resulted from all of that could not have been made at 20. It could only have been made then, in that season, by that person. After all of that, the delay was not a delay. It was the preparation. And somewhere much further north, where the winter was longer and the mountains held their snow until late spring, the last story of this night was already beginning to dissolve into the silence it would become. Let this grow quiet around you now. She made the bowl she could make, in the season that was hers. Not the bowl she would have made at 20. Not the bowl a more skilled potter would have made. The bowl that could only exist because she had lived the specific life she had lived, with all its interruptions and weight. The poem was waiting inside her for 20 years, and the bowl waited for the poem. And when they found each other, in a small, cold room in autumn, what they made together could be held in two hands. You have been comparing your bowl to bowls made on better days, in calmer seasons, by people who came to the clay before you did. But your bowl is made from everything you have carried. The weight of it is in the clay. The years are in the glaze. The interruptions are in the unevenness. And the unevenness is what makes it what it is. The poem and the bowl are real. The other life is not. Set it down gently. It has been held long enough tonight. The breath is moving now, the way the moon moves, not hurrying, not waiting, simply doing what it has always done, in the only season it has ever known, which is this one, which is now. Let the hands open if they have been holding. Let the chest soften. There is nothing that needs to be made tonight. The kiln is cold. The bowl is finished. The poem has found its place. If sleep comes, let it come. The bowl will still be there in the morning. You do not have to have arrived. You only have to be here, which you already are, in the only season available to you, which is this one, in the only body available to you, which is this one, breathing in the dark exactly as you always have, at the pace that has always been yours. There is a place in the mountains where the snow comes early and stays long, where the pines hold their needles through every season, and the silence between the trees has a specific weight to it. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of accumulation. The silence of many winters, laid one on top of the other, until silence itself becomes a kind of substance. Something you can feel against the skin when you stand still long enough. From somewhere deep in the pines, before the snow began in earnest, you could hear a single bird calling at intervals too long to be conversational, a sound more like punctuation than language, the sound of something marking time in a place where time is not in a hurry to be marked. The last light before dark had gone, the particular deep orange that high-altitude cold produces, the orange of something burning very slowly and with complete patience. And the air carried what mountain air carries in early winter, the resin of the pine trees and the clean cold that has no smell of its own but makes every other smell more precise. And something underneath both of these, the specific smell of stone and snowmelt, and the long, slow waiting of a place that has been a place for much longer than anyone living can remember. The temple at the edge of this place was small. It had been small for a long time. The wood of its outer walls had gone, the silver grey that wood goes when it has been cold and then warm and then cold again. Uncountably, over many decades. The main hall held a single lamp, which had been burning since the evening prayers, and its light was amber and steady in the way of lamps that are not being asked to do much, not to illuminate a large space, not to make the night into day, only to be present in the dark in the way that presence is sometimes its own kind of enough. The bell at the corner of the roof made one sound in autumn and a different sound in winter. The way the same bell sounds different depending on what the air is carrying. In the winter, the bell sounded like something letting go. The monk who had been sitting in the innermost room of this temple since before the snow began was old in the way that certain people become old, not diminished, only concentrated, like a liquid that has been reduced very slowly until what remains is the essential thing. He had been a practitioner for more years than most people live. He had had teachers and students, and a tradition he could name, and a lineage he could trace. All of that was true, but tonight none of it was present in the room with him. Tonight there was only the breath, and the cold coming through the wall, and the sound of the snow against the outside of the building. He had been, for much of his life, with excellent compere. This was not a flaw he had been born with. It was a skill he had developed because the tradition required precision, because the teachings required understanding, because the path required some ability to assess whether you were on it or not. He had applied this skill to his practice the way a craftsman applies a tool, with care and focus, and the expectation that the tool would eventually produce what he was trying to produce. He had measured his progress. He had measured it against his teachers, against his fellow students, against the written accounts of practitioners who had come before him. He had found himself, repeatedly, insufficient, not dramatically insufficient. He had never been the worst practitioner in any room he entered, only persistently, accurately insufficient in ways that had names he knew and could not resolve. He was not reviewing his life tonight. He was not making an accounting. He was not comparing what he had managed to do with what he might have done if different choices had been made in different seasons. He had done all of that in his middle years, the way everyone does, and it had taught him what it teaches, that the accounting never closes, that the comparison never resolves, that the only end to the comparing is not a better answer, but a different orientation. The orientation of a person who has finally stopped asking the question, because the question is not, "It turns out," The kind of question that has an answer. The kind that has an answer is, what time is it? Will the snow stop by morning? Is the fire still burning in the outer hall? The kind that doesn't is, was my life enough? Did I move at the right pace? Did I arrive where I was supposed to arrive? He had spent years not knowing this distinction. He had spent years directing enormous intelligence and care at questions that would not yield, and then, gradually, over more years than he would have wished, he had stopped. Not because he found the answers, because he noticed that the questions were the sound of a mind that had not yet learned to be at rest, and that the rest was available, and that it did not require the questions to be answered first. It only required that he sit here, in this room, in this winter, with the cold coming through the wall, and the snow against the outside, and the breath moving in the only direction breath moves, which is in and then out, in and then out, in exactly the rhythm that belongs to this body and no other, in exactly the season that is this body's season, which is now. He was not ahead of where he was. He was not behind where he was. He was where he was, in a room, in the winter, in the dark, completely. This was not a small thing. It had taken him a very long time. It had taken him teachers who pointed at the moon, and students who asked questions he could not answer, and decades of practice that produced not the enlightenment he had imagined in his younger years, but something quieter and more reliable, the capacity to be present in a room, in the dark, in the winter, without needing the room to be different, or the dark to be lighter, or the winter to be over. The capacity to be here without the here needing to be somewhere else. He was not proud of this. Pride was not the appropriate response to arriving, after a long time, at the place you had always been. What he felt, if he could be said to feel anything that required a name, was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a traveler who, after many detours, finds themselves at the door they were always going to find, and sees that it was never locked, and steps through. Outside, the pines held their needles as they had always held them, through the cold and through the wind, without comment on the cold or the wind. The needles were not preparing to be ready. They were not accumulating patience for the spring. They were simply needles, in the dark, in the cold, doing what needles do, which is to hold on, and hold the light when light comes, and release nothing that is not ready to be released. The snow fell through the branches and reached the ground when it reached it. This was the whole story. The snow fell and reached the ground, and the ground received it. And the silence after was not different from the silence before, except that it was more itself, which is what silence becomes when something passes through it. The branch that had been bent by accumulation through the long afternoon eventually released its load, in a small sound, barely a sound. More, the suggestion of a sound, the sound of something that had been held long enough, and now was not, and straightened slowly back to where it had been, or close to where it had been. Nothing in the forest asked the branch when it was going to do this. Nothing counted the hours the branch held. The holding was the holding, and the releasing was the releasing, and between the two of them the branch did what branches do, in the season of branches, which is always this season, which is always now. The bell at the corner of the roof rang once, in the wind. The sound of it crossed the clearing between the temple and the tree line and entered the trees and was absorbed, in the way that all sounds are absorbed by enough distance. And the silence after it was the same silence that had been there before, only more itself. The monk breathed in. He breathed out. The fire in the outer hall had burned low without anyone attending it. As fires though. The cold was a little more present now at the edges of the room. He did not mind the cold. He had been cold before, and it had not shortened the night. And the night always completed itself regardless of how cold it was. And the morning always arrived regardless of whether the fire in the outer hall had been kept. He was not waiting for the morning. He was not waiting for anything. He was only here, which was where he had always been. Even in the years of comparing and accounting and asking, he had been here the whole time, without knowing it, the way a tree is in its own season the whole time, even in winter, even when there is no visible evidence of what it is preparing to become. The branch releases the snow. The snow reaches the ground. The silence returns. You have come a long way tonight. Not in miles, in something else. In the distance between the mind that compares and the mind that simply is here. Between the voice that says you are behind. You are insufficient. You have not yet arrived. And the voice that says nothing, that only breathes, that only holds the next breath for exactly as long as the next breath needs to be held. You have traveled through 9 lives tonight. 9 different centuries. 9 different corners of the world. 9 different people who each faced, in their own season, in their own language, in their own room, the same tightening in the chest that you know. The young monk in the Goryeo monastery who stood in the garden in the moonlight and saw the late blooming plum tree entirely open, and understood, without being told, that he had never been late, only in his own season. The weaver who walked home along the river in the afternoon light and stopped on the stone bridge and watched the water moving and felt, for the first time in years, that she was only walking, not arriving late, not falling behind, only moving in a body that was hers at a pace that was its own. The disciple in the high cave who carried his resentment into the silence of 3 days of sitting and emerged on the 4th morning to find, looking at the river in the early light, that both channels were water and both channels were going the same direction and neither of them was behind. The scholar in the winter tent who learned from a young woman who could not read the source language that the difference between his work and the other scholar's work was the difference between a map and being in the place, and that the world needed both. The girl who sat in the courtyard until she found, on the 4th attempt, the answer that was too simple to have arrived at sooner. The flower doesn't know any of that. It just falls. The student in the Bhutanese monastery who discovered, when his teacher returned his unread letter and asked what enough would look like, that he had never asked himself this, and that, not knowing the answer was, it turned out, a beginning. The merchant on the hillside in Burma who learned the breath for 10 minutes and felt the comparing withdraw to the edge of the room, the way furniture withdraws when the light changes, and carried that feeling down the hill to the river and across the river and home. The nun in the cold room in Kyoto who held the finished bowl in 2 hands and felt it warm and understood that the life she had lived was the only available material for the life she was making, and that the bowl could not have been what it was without every interrupted season that preceded it. 9 lives. 1 night. 1 image that moved through all of them like a thread, not announced, not explained, only present. The way a key signature is present in a piece of music, you don't hear it directly, only in the way everything else sounds. Each of them was you, in a different century, in a different body, in a different corner of the world that turns out, from the inside, to feel remarkably like the same corner. The corner where you are not, yet where you thought you would be. Where someone else seems to have arrived earlier, where the path has taken longer than expected and you are not sure you are still on it. And each of them arrived, eventually, here, at the same place you are now, a place that has no address and no calendar date, a place made entirely of breath and dark and the weight of the surface beneath you, which has been holding you this whole time without being asked, without requiring anything of you in return, only holding. Somewhere in the middle of the night, somewhere in the space between one story and the next, something settled in you, not an understanding, not a conclusion, but a quality of ease, the ease of something that has been carried for a long time and set down. The hands are open now. The weight is not there. The hands are simply hands, resting. In the dark, the cherry tree does not bloom early because the tree next to it bloomed first. It waits. It does not know it is waiting. The cold does what cold does to it, and the warmth does what warmth does, and the tree does what it has always done, holds what it holds, through the season that asks it to hold. And then, one morning, when no one predicted it and no one was counting, opens, not late, not early, in its own time, which was the only time it was ever going to be. You are in your own time, not a worse time than you would have chosen, not a later time than you would have preferred. The time that is yours, which has given you what it has given you, and asked of you what it has asked, and is still giving and still asking, right now, in this dark, in this moment, that is this moment, and none other. This is your season, the one that was always going to be this one, the one that is, if you let it be what it is, already enough. Let the weight of the night settle now, not into the answers, into the body, into the surface that has been holding you the entire time you have been lying here in the dark, turning the questions over and over, and will go on holding you when the questions have grown quiet. And when you have grown quiet, and when the only thing remaining is the breath, let the breath carry what is left. It is light enough now to carry. It has been getting lighter all night, with each story, a small amount of weight set down, until what remains is only this, the breath, moving in its own season, unhurried, sufficient, belonging entirely to this body, and this night, and this darkness that is not the absence of anything but only the presence of quiet. There is nothing more required tonight. The accounting is set aside. The comparison has, for now, released its hold. The question of whether you have arrived at the right place in the right time is no longer the loudest thing in the room. What is loudest now is the breath, and the breath is not asking anything. It is only here. Let yourself be here with it. Let the weight go. Let the spine settle. Let the eyes stay closed if they are closed, or let them close if they are not. The morning is coming in the same direction it has always come from, at the same pace it has always moved, without any concern for whether you are ready. You do not have to be ready. You only have to be here. The branch releases the snow. The snow reaches the ground. The silence returns, more itself than it was before. And somewhere in a mountain temple, in the long, cold dark before the morning, an old monk breathes in and breathes out, and the night completes itself around him, as it always has, as it always will, without being asked to hurry, without being asked to wait, only doing what the night does, in its own season, at the pace that has always been its own. In the last dark before the cold breaks, a cherry blossom branch carries its buds the way it always has. Not yet. Not yet. And then, in one morning nobody predicted, yes, that was where we began. And now, after 9 lives and many centuries, here it is again, not resolved, only arrived at. The branch that was bare at the beginning of the night is still bare, but something has changed in the quality of the watching. We travel tonight from the hills above Haeju to a river village in Vietnam, from a Tibetan cave to a Mongolian winter tent, from a courtyard in Sri Lanka to a mountain temple in Bhutan, from the Sagaing Hills to a cold room in Kyoto where a poet held a bowl in 2 hands and felt the full weight of everything she had carried pressing upward into the clay. They were all carrying the same thing. They each set it down in a different season, in a different language. And here you are, a little lighter, or at least a little more familiar with the weight. Here is the one thing tonight asked you to know. You are not behind. You have never been behind. The calendar that says you are late was measuring your life against a life that does not exist. What is available is this: the life you are in, which is already, if you let it be what it is, exactly what it was always going to be. The bowl you are making can only be made now, with everything you have carried. The flower you are is not late. The water you are is already in the valley. You are in your own season, not a lesser one, the season that is yours. I need to say something honest before the night ends. I found Rengetsu's story while looking for something else entirely, and I could not stop reading. The image of her holding that first inscribed bowl at 42, after all of it, the bowl warm from the firing, the poem finally having a place to live, it felt dishonest to leave out. Let tonight's understanding settle now, not as information, but as warmth. You do not have to remember how the fire worked. Only notice that you are warmer than you were. You are already more than you think you are. You have permission to stop measuring. Whatever tomorrow asks of you, let it find you rested, with a little more trust in the pace that is yours. If a word from tonight is still with you, leave it in the comments. Knowing you are here matters. Sleep well, and when the morning comes, in its own time, as it always has, let it find you here, already where you were supposed to be, already exactly on time. The branch does not hurry. It is already becoming what it is going to be.